3 days after I gave birth to twins, my mother-in-law showed up with my husband's mistress and a set of divorce papers. "Take $22 million and sign it. I only want the kids." I signed and disappeared that very night. By morning, she realized that something had gone terribly wrong. My name is Natalie, and I am 34 years old. I lay in the pristine white bed of the most exclusive maternity suite in Manhattan, staring at the cashier check resting on my lap. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to outsmart a toxic family member who thought their money made them untouchable. The sterile smell of the hospital room was completely masked by the overwhelming scent of expensive perfume. Patricia was my mother-in-law, a ruthless matriarch, who ran her family and their corporate empire with an iron fist. She stood at the foot of my bed, her designer heels sinking into the plush rug. Next to her was Spencer, my husband of 5 years. He was staring intensely at his phone, his jaw tight, refusing to meet my eyes. Leaning against the windowsill was Amanda. She was 24, a former social media influencer, and currently scrolling through newborn designer clothes on her tablet, completely unbothered by the fact that she was standing in the recovery room of the woman whose husband she had stolen. "Sign the papers, Natalie," Patricia commanded, her voice slicing through the quiet room like a blade. "The $22 million is more than someone from your pathetic middle-class background could ever dream of making in a lifetime. I want full custody of you. You will pack your bag, sign the divorce decree, and leave the country by midnight." I looked down at the documents. They were thick, filled with legal jargon designed to intimidate. Then I looked at the check. $22 million. It was a staggering amount of money, enough to make most people walk away without a second thought. I felt the physical pain of my recent delivery, but I pushed it down deep inside. I did not cry. I did not scream or beg my husband to defend me. "Spencer," I said softly, testing the waters, "are you really going to let your mother buy your children?" Spencer shifted uncomfortably, finally glancing up from his screen. "It is for the best, Natalie. You know you do not fit in with our world. The boys need to be raised with the family legacy in mind. Amanda and I can provide that. Just take the money and start over." Amanda did not even look up from her screen when she chimed in. I found the cutest matching cashmere outfits for them. "Do not worry, Natalie. I will make sure the nannies take great care of your kids." I took a deep breath, feeling the dull ache of my incision, but my mind was sharper than ever. I picked up the check, holding it up to the light. $22 million, I mused aloud, keeping my voice perfectly steady. "It is a very specific number, Patricia. You could have offered 20 or rounded up to 25, but $22 million is fascinating." Patricia narrowed her eyes, clearly annoyed that I was not breaking down into tears. "It is a generous offer. Do not push your luck, you ungrateful gold digger." I smiled, a cold, calculated smile that made Spencer take a step back. "I do not think it is generosity at all," I replied. As a matter of fact, I was reviewing the company third-quarter financial audit right before I went into labor. And would you look at that? Exactly $22 million was unaccounted for in the offshore logistics subsidiary, the exact same amount you are now handing me on a silver platter. The silence in the room was deafening. Spencer dropped his phone on the floor. Amanda finally stopped scrolling, looking confusedly between Patricia and me. Patricia lost a fraction of her color, her arrogant posture stiffening. She had underestimated me from the day we met, assuming that because I did not come from old money, I was stupid. But I was a corporate actuary. I lived and breathed financial data, risk assessment, and numbers. I knew every dirty little secret hidden in their corporate ledgers. "You are delusional," Patricia snapped, recovering her composure quickly, though her voice wavered just a fraction. "Sign the papers before I take the money off the table and leave you with nothing. You cannot fight my lawyers, Natalie. We will drag you through family court until you are bankrupt." "I am not going to fight your lawyers," I said calmly. I reached over to the bedside table and picked up my pen. I did not tell them that my African-American brother-in-law, Terrence, a brilliant corporate attorney who despised Patricia just as much as I did, had already reviewed every single vulnerability in their trust fund. I did not tell them that by handing me this specific check, Patricia had just given me the ultimate leverage to take everything they owned. Amanda shifted her weight, letting out a loud theatrical sigh. She stepped away from the window and walked over to Spencer, wrapping her arms around his waist. She rested her chin on his shoulder and stared at me with a sickeningly sweet smile. "You really should just take the money, Natalie," Amanda said, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. "Spencer could easily freeze all your joint accounts by morning. He already talked to his lawyers about it. You would be left with absolutely nothing. You should be grateful Patricia is even offering you a dime after how much you have embarrassed this family." I did not even blink at her. I shifted my gaze right past Amanda, treating her like a speck of dust on the wall, and looked directly at Patricia. "I am not accepting a paper check," I stated firmly, dropping the piece of paper back onto the pristine hospital blanket. Patricia crossed her arms, her diamond bracelets clinking together. "Excuse me," she snapped. "Are you suddenly too good for a cashier check?" "I am an actuary, Patricia. I deal in risk management," I replied, my voice smooth and devoid of any emotion. "A paper check from a corporate account requires clearing time. Given the volatile state of your offshore logistics subsidiary, there is a high probability that your board could flag a $22 million withdrawal by Monday morning. Or worse, you could simply place a stop payment order the second you walk out of this room. The liquidity risk is entirely unacceptable. If you want my signature on these documents tonight, you will authorize an immediate irrevocable wire transfer into my personal account right now." For a moment, the room was dead silent. Then, Patricia threw her head back and let out a sharp, mocking laugh. It echoed off the sterile hospital walls. She looked at Spencer and shook her head. "Do you hear this, Spencer? Your wife is sitting in a hospital bed bleeding, and she is giving us a lecture on liquidity risks. This is exactly why she was never meant for our world. All that nerdy actuary talk just to hide the fact that she is a desperate, greedy little woman scrambling for her payout." Patricia pulled her phone from her designer handbag. She dialed a number, her eyes never leaving my face. She wanted to save her this moment, believing she had completely broken me. "Wake up, Richard," she barked into the phone, addressing her private wealth manager. "I do not care what time it is. I need an immediate, expedited wire transfer of $22 million cleared right this second. Yes, for my primary holding account. Use the priority routing protocol." She rattled off my banking details, which her private investigators had undoubtedly pulled weeks ago. I sat perfectly still, regulating my breathing. In my mind, I was already moving the pieces on the chessboard. Patricia thought she was buying my children. She thought she was buying my silence. She had no idea she was funding her own destruction. We waited in silence. Amanda went back to scrolling on her tablet, completely oblivious to the massive shift in power that was happening in that very room. Spencer kept his eyes glued to the floor, too much of a coward to witness the end of his marriage. 5 minutes later, my phone vibrated on the bedside table. I reached over and picked it up. A notification from my bank flashed across the screen. An incoming priority wire transfer of $22 million had successfully cleared and was now sitting securely in my personal account. The funds were fully liquid and entirely under my control. I set the phone down. I picked up the heavy gold-plated pen Patricia had left on the bed. Without a single tremor in my hand, I flipped to the last page of the thick legal document she had provided. I signed my name with a smooth, sweeping motion. I did not bother reading the preceding pages because I did not need to. Terrence and I had already anticipated exactly what kind of paperwork Patricia would try to force on me. I handed the document back to her. Patricia snatched it from my hand, a look of ultimate triumph washing over her sharp features. She carefully placed the signed paper into her leather folder. "Enjoy your money, Natalie," Patricia sneered, looking down her nose at me. "You have until dawn to pack whatever cheap belongings you brought here. I am sending my private security team to this hospital at exactly 6 in the morning to collect my grandchildren." If you are still in this building when they arrive, I will have you arrested for trespassing. Let us go, Spencer." They turned and walked out of the room, Amanda trailing behind them with a smug little wave. The heavy wooden door clicked shut. I was finally alone. I looked at the clock on the wall. It was nearly midnight. I had exactly 6 hours before Patricia realized she had just made the biggest mistake of her entire life. The heavy wooden door had barely clicked shut before I threw the thin hospital blanket off my legs. Every muscle in my abdomen screamed in protest, a sharp reminder of the delivery just 3 days prior. I ignored the searing pain. I reached over to my arm and smoothly pulled the intravenous needle from my vein, pressing a cotton swab against the small drop of blood that welled up. There was no time to be weak. I grabbed my phone from the nightstand and dialed the one person in the world who hated Patricia as much as I did. Terrence answered on the first ring. He was Spencer's brother-in-law, married to Spencer's older sister, Caroline. Terrence was a brilliant African-American corporate attorney, a man who had built his own wealth from nothing, and despised the toxic entitlement of my husband's family. He had been my secret ally for the past 6 months, ever since I first discovered Spencer's affair with Amanda. "The wire just cleared," I said, keeping my voice hushed but urgent. $22 million is in the primary account." I heard Terrence chuckle deeply on the other end of the line. "Patricia actually fell for it. She handed you the exact amount we needed to execute the hostile takeover. The sheer arrogance of that woman will be her absolute ruin. Are you ready to move, Natalie?" "I am ready," I replied, standing up and wrapping a heavy cashmere cardigan over my hospital gown. "Is the transport in position?" The private medical evacuation helicopter is idling on the south helipad of the roof, Terrence confirmed. "I have secured the private elevator override. You have a 4-minute window before the night shift nurses do their midnight rounds in the very important person ward. Go get my niece and nephew." I ended the call and slipped my feet into a pair of comfortable loafers. I opened the door of my suite and peered into the dimly lit hallway. The very important person maternity floor was quiet, smelling of strong antiseptic and fresh lilies. I moved quickly, my steps muffled by the thick carpet. I knew exactly where the security cameras were positioned because I had spent the last 3 months memorizing the architectural blueprints of this hospital. I hugged the left wall, completely avoiding the lens of the primary corridor camera. I reached the private neonatal nursery at the end of the hall because I was paying out of pocket for the most expensive suite. My twins had their own dedicated room. The night nurse on duty was a young woman named Sarah, whom Terrence had already vetted and generously compensated for her absolute discretion. When I walked in, she nodded silently. She had already dressed my babies in warm fleece outfits and secured them into 2 portable travel bassinets. "Thank you," I whispered, taking the heavy bassinets by their sturdy handles. "The service elevator is unlocked and holding on this floor," the nurse replied quietly. "Good luck, Natalie. Do not look back." I carried my children down the back corridor, my arms straining under the weight, my surgical incision burning with every step. But the adrenaline surging through my veins pushed the pain away. I reached the service elevator, pressed the glowing button, and the doors slid open instantly. I stepped inside and swiped the magnetic keycard Terrence had slipped to me a week ago. The elevator bypassed the main floors entirely, shooting straight up to the roof. When the metal doors opened to the night air, the deafening roar of the helicopter blades hit me like a physical force. The freezing wind whipped my hair around my face. Terrence was waiting on the tarmac, dressed in a sharp black trench coat, his expression focused and determined. He rushed forward, taking the bassinets from my aching arms and carefully loading them into the secure medical bays inside the spacious cabin of the private chopper. I climbed in right behind him, collapsing into the leather seat and buckling my heavy safety harness. Terrence gave the pilot a sharp nod, and the helicopter instantly lifted off the hospital roof. The sudden vertical ascent made my stomach drop, but a profound wave of relief washed over my entirely exhausted body. We banked sharply over the city. I looked out the reinforced window, watching the glittering skyline of New York City shrink beneath us. The towering glass skyscrapers, the very empire Patricia believed she controlled with absolute authority, looked so incredibly small and fragile from up here. Terrence handed me a secure tablet. I tapped the screen and opened my encrypted banking application. I watched the live feed of the financial transactions. The $22 million was no longer sitting in my primary account. Our custom automated algorithms were already working, fracturing the massive sum and dispersing it into 20 different anonymous shell corporations registered in Delaware and the Cayman Islands. They will arrive at 6 in the morning to find an empty room, Terrence said, his deep voice crackling over the aviation headset. I leaned back against the seat, listening to the rhythmic hum of the helicopter blades slicing through the dark sky. "Let them come," I replied softly. The morning sun had barely crested the New York skyline when the gold-plated doors of the VIP elevator slid open on the maternity floor. Patricia marched out like a general leading an invasion. She was flanked by 2 massive private security guards wearing dark suits and earpieces. Spencer trailed slightly behind her, clutching a customized leather baby carrier in each hand, looking bleary-eyed and miserable. Amanda dragged her feet next to him, holding a massive iced coffee and loudly complaining about the early hour. Patricia ignored them both. She marched straight down the quiet hallway, her heels clicking aggressively against the polished marble floor. She was ready to claim her ultimate prize. They reached my suite at the end of the corridor. Patricia did not bother knocking. She signaled to one of the guards, who pushed the heavy door open. Patricia strode into the room, expecting to find me sitting on the edge of the bed weeping over my packed bags. Instead, she found absolute silence. The hospital bed was freshly made with crisp white sheets. The monitors were turned off. The small vase of flowers I had received from a CO worker was sitting abandoned on the nightstand. The room was entirely devoid of life. Patricia froze in her tracks. She looked around the empty space, her perfectly drawn eyebrows pulling together in confusion. She snapped her fingers at the guards. "Check the bathroom," she ordered sharply. "Check the closets. She is probably hiding in there trying to drag this out." The guards moved quickly, clearing the room with tactical precision. They opened the bathroom door, pulling back the shower curtain. They checked the heavy mahogany wardrobe. One of them turned back to Patricia and shook his head. "The room is completely clear, ma'am," the guard reported. "There is nobody here." Spencer dropped the baby carriers on the floor. "What do you mean nobody is here?" he demanded, his voice pitching up in panic. "Where is my wife? Where are my children?" Amanda took a loud sip of her iced coffee. "Maybe she actually took the money and ran," Amanda suggested with a careless shrug. "I told you she was just a gold digger, Spencer. You should be happy she is finally gone." Patricia ignored the mistress. Her face was turning a dangerous shade of purple. She spun around and stormed back out into the hallway, marching directly toward the central nurse station. A morning shift nurse was sitting behind the high desk, quietly updating patient charts. Patricia slammed her hands flat on the counter, making the poor woman jump out of her chair. "Where is the patient from room 400? Patricia demanded, her voice echoing down the entire ward. "Where is Natalie, and where are those 2 babies?" The nurse blinked clearly, intimidated by the angry billionaire and her massive security detail. She nervously typed my name into her computer system. The nurse frowned at the screen. According to the system, the patient officially discharged herself at 2 in the morning. Against medical advice, the nurse stammered. "She and the infants are no longer on the premises." Patricia lost her mind. She slammed her fist against the desk, sending a cup of pens flying across the floor. "Discharged," Patricia screamed at the top of her lungs. "You do not just discharge 2 newborns in the middle of the night. This is a secure facility." How did a penniless nobody walk out of here with the heirs to my entire empire without anyone noticing? "I demand to speak to the hospital administrator immediately. Lock down this entire building right now." Spencer was pacing back and forth, dragging his hands through his hair. "This is a nightmare," he kept muttering. "If the board finds out the children are missing, I am completely ruined." Patricia pulled her phone from her purse, her hands shaking with absolute rage. "This is a kidnapping," she declared loudly, pointing a manicured finger at the terrified nurse. "That crazy woman has abducted my grandchildren." I am calling the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation right now. He is a personal friend of mine, and he will have federal agents tearing this city apart within the hour. Natalie is going to spend the rest of her pathetic life in a federal prison. Patricia began dialing the number, her chest heaving with fury. The security guard stood by, ready to follow her next brutal command. Spencer looked like he was about to pass out, while Amanda just sighed and leaned against the wall, clearly bored by the family drama. The hospital administrator came running down the hall, looking panicked. But before Patricia could press the call button, the heavy doors at the end of the corridor swung open. A slow and deliberate clapping sound echoed through the tense silence of the ward. Everyone turned around. A tall African-American man in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit was walking casually down the hallway. It was Terrence. He carried a sleek black leather briefcase in one hand and wore a calm, incredibly dangerous smile on his face. He stopped a few feet away from the furious matriarch. He looked at the screaming woman, then at the panicking husband, and finally at the confused mistress. "I would put that phone down if I were you, Patricia," Terrence said, his deep voice carrying a terrifying sense of authority. "I would put that phone down if I were you." Patricia, Terrence said, his deep voice carrying a terrifying sense of authority. Patricia froze her manicured thumb, hovering just an inch above the call button. She glared at her son-in-law, her eyes narrowing with absolute venom. "What on earth are you doing here, Terrence?" she demanded, lowering the phone, but keeping it gripped tightly in her hand. "Do not tell me you are involved in this mess. Your loyalty is to this family, not to that ungrateful little thief. My loyalty is to the law." Patricia, Terrence replied smoothly, coming to a halt right in front of her. The two massive security guards stepped forward trying to intimidate him, but Terrence did not even blink. "And as of this morning, I am officially acting as legal counsel for Natalie. Calling the federal authorities would be a catastrophic mistake for you, your company, and your personal freedom." Patricia let out a harsh, mocking laugh. "You are her lawyer. How pathetic. She manipulated you just like she manipulated my idiot son. But you are too late, Terrence. Your client is a kidnapper. She signed away her maternal rights last night. I have the legally binding paperwork right here in my bag." Patricia unzipped her designer tote bag and yanked out the leather folder. She pulled out the thick document I had signed just hours earlier, holding it up like a trophy. "She took my $22 million, and she signed the custody relinquishment forms," Patricia declared proudly, her voice echoing down the corridor. "She committed federal fraud and kidnapping in one night. I am going to bury her." Terrence looked at the document in her hand. Then slowly a deep rumble of laughter began in his chest. The laughter grew louder, echoing off the marble walls. It was not a polite chuckle. It was a dark, victorious laugh that made Spencer visibly flinch. "What is so funny?" Spencer asked nervously, his eyes darting between his mother and his brother-in-law. Patricia, Terrence said, finally catching his breath and adjusting his pristine silk tie. "You are the chairwoman of a multinational logistics corporation. You have teams of corporate lawyers at your beck and call. And yet, in your sheer arrogance, you did not bother to read the fine print of the document you brought to a hospital room at midnight." Patricia frowned. She quickly flipped to the last page, pointing a trembling finger at the signature line. "Her signature is right here, Terrence. I watched her sign it with my own eyes. Read the title on page 2. Patricia, Terrence instructed calmly. "Not the cover page your lawyers drafted. Read the actual legally binding header on the second page. The one Natalie discreetly swapped in when you were busy insulting her." Patricia furiously flipped back a page. Her eyes scanned the bold text at the top of the sheet. Suddenly, all the color drained from her face. Her perfectly applied makeup could not hide the sickly pale shade her skin turned. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. "Read it out loud," Mother Spencer urged, stepping forward in sheer panic. "What does it say?" Terrence smiled, a cold and calculated expression. "I can save her the trouble, Spencer. It is not a custody relinquishment form. It is an irrevocable gift authorization. Amanda gasped loudly, nearly dropping her iced coffee. "Wait, what does that mean?" "It means," Terrence explained slowly, savoring every single syllable, "that Patricia just legally gifted $22 million to a secure trust fund established strictly for the benefit of her newborn grandchildren. And according to the ironclad terms of that trust, the sole managing executor with absolute control over those funds is their biological mother, Natalie." "That is impossible," Patricia whispered hoarsely, her hands shaking so violently the paper rattled. "She signed the divorce papers too. She agreed to give Spencer full custody." "Wrong again," Terrence countered, snapping his briefcase open and pulling out a certified legal envelope. "Natalie did not sign your divorce papers. She simply signed an acknowledgement of receipt. As for the divorce itself, Natalie filed her own petition 6 months ago in the state family court. She cited at-fault grounds for adultery, complete with hundreds of photographs, text messages, and hotel receipts documenting Spencer and Amanda over the past year. Because of the infidelity clause in your own family trust, default custody remains entirely with the mother." Patricia looked like she was going to have a heart attack right there in the hospital hallway. "You orchestrated this," she hissed at Terrence, her voice barely a whisper. "I will call the police right now and have you both arrested for extortion." Terrence leaned in close, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Call them, Patricia. Call the police. But the second you do, I will hand over the audio recording Natalie captured last night, the one where you explicitly offered a mother $22 million in exchange for buying her human infants. The feds call that child trafficking, and I promise you they will not let you wear your designer heels in federal prison." Patricia stood completely frozen, the heavy legal documents slipping from her trembling fingers and fluttering to the hospital floor. The legal guillotine had just dropped, and she realized she had willingly placed her own head on the chopping block. Patricia did not apologize. She did not surrender. Instead, she retreated to her Manhattan penthouse and unleashed the one weapon she still had absolute control over, her vast media connections. By noon the following day, my face was plastered across every major news network and tabloid site in the country. The headlines were brutal and heavily coordinated. They did not call me a mother protecting her children. They painted me as an unstable, greedy gold digger who had suffered a severe mental breakdown. High-profile psychiatrists who had never even met me were suddenly on daytime television diagnosing me with postpartum psychosis. They analyzed my background, tearing apart my middle-class upbringing to prove I was just a desperate woman trying to extort a prestigious family. According to the narrative Patricia paid millions to spin, I had extorted her for $22 million in a state of sheer delusion, and then kidnapped the sole heirs to the family empire. They claimed I was a danger to myself and my newborn twins. Spencer played his part perfectly. He stood on the steps of their corporate headquarters looking disheveled and heartbroken, begging the cameras for the safe return of his sons. Amanda was conveniently kept out of the frame. The public backlash was instantaneous and vicious. My social media accounts were flooded with death threats from strangers demanding I return the children to their wealthy, loving family. I watched all of this unfold from the living room of a highly secured private compound tucked deep in the Catskill Mountains. Terrence had arranged the safe house months in advance. It was surrounded by electric gates and guarded by former military contractors who answered only to him. My babies were sleeping peacefully in their cribs, completely unaware of the massive storm raging outside. I sat on the leather sofa glaring at the television screen, my hands curled into tight fists. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to release the audio recordings and the proof of Spencer having an affair to clear my name immediately. Terrence walked into the room carrying a cup of black coffee and hit the power button on the remote, shutting off the television. "Do not let her get in your head, Natalie," he said calmly, handing me the mug. "This is exactly what Patricia wants. She wants you to panic and make an emotional counter move. But we are not playing a public relations game. We are playing a legal one. The trap has already been set, but it needs time to properly close around her neck. You have the money, and you have the children. Let her scream into the void for a few more days." My phone buzzed on the coffee table. It was a secure, encrypted line. I picked it up and heard the sharp, anxious voice of Caroline, my sister-in-law, and Terrence's wife. Caroline was the only person in that toxic family who had managed to escape her mother and her suffocating grip. "Natalie, are you and the twins okay?" Caroline asked, her voice trembling slightly. "I saw the news. My mother is going absolutely scorched earth. She just fired 3 board members who dared to question the negative press she is attracting." "We are safe, Caroline," I assured her, taking a slow sip of the hot coffee. "But why is she pushing this hard? The $22 million is a loss, but it is not enough to bankrupt her. Why risk federal charges to fake a kidnapping narrative on national television?" Caroline sighed deeply on the other end of the line. "Because it is not about the $22 million, Natalie. It is about the grandfather clause in the primary family trust. You know Spencer turns 35 this coming Friday, right?" I nodded, even though she could not see me. "Yes. His birthday is in 4 days." Caroline lowered her voice as if her mother could somehow hear her. "The $500 million trust my grandfather established has a strict lineage stipulation. Spencer must produce legitimate biological heirs before his 35th birthday. If he fails to do so, the entire trust defaults to the corporate board of directors. The board will immediately seize control of the company and vote my mother out of the chairwoman seat. They have been trying to oust her for years." I stared at the blank television screen as the mathematical pieces of the puzzle perfectly clicked together in my mind. Spencer and his affair with Amanda, the desperate midnight hospital visit, the massive $22 million bribe. It all made perfect sense now. Patricia did not care about my children at all. She only viewed my twins as corporate assets. Without those babies legally secured in her custody by Friday, she was going to lose the entire $500 million empire. The revelation hung heavily in the air. I hung up the secure phone with Caroline and set it down on the coffee table. The massive puzzle was finally complete. Patricia was a cornered animal, and cornered animals always made foolish public mistakes. The following morning, Terrence walked into the living room of the safe house just as the sun was rising over the mountains. He was holding a fresh pot of coffee and a television remote control. "Turn on the national broadcast," Terrence said, his voice completely flat. Patricia just played her next card. I grabbed the remote and switched on the large flat-screen television mounted on the wall. The screen instantly filled with the brightly lit studio of the most watched morning news program in America. Sitting on the plush curved sofa opposite the famous veteran anchor were Spencer and my husband's mistress Amanda. Spencer was dressed in a conservative dark navy suit. He looked intentionally exhausted. His hair was slightly ruffled, and dark circles had been expertly applied under his eyes to give the illusion of a heartbroken father who had not slept in days. Amanda sat pressed tightly against his side. She was wearing a modest pastel blue dress that completely contradicted her usual flashy social media persona. She had her hand resting protectively on his arm, looking like the perfect supportive partner. The anchor leaned forward, his face etched with practiced media sympathy. "Spencer," the anchor began softly, his voice echoing through my quiet living room. "The entire nation is praying for the safe return of your newborn sons. How are you holding up during this unimaginable tragedy?" Spencer looked down at his hands and let out a shaky, dramatic breath. "I am just absolutely terrified," Spencer lied with flawless execution. "Natalie has always struggled with her mental health, but I never thought she would suffer a complete break from reality. I never thought she would take the boys and run away from the medical care she so desperately needs. I just want my sons back safe in my arms." It was an incredibly convincing performance. If I did not know that this man was a spineless coward who had stood silently while his mother tried to buy my children for $22 million, I might have actually believed him. I watched his face closely. As an actuary, I am trained to spot discrepancies in data, and right now Spencer's body language was screaming absolute fraud. The anchor then turned his attention to the mistress, and Amanda the anchor said gently, "This must be an incredibly difficult situation for you to navigate in the public eye. You have been aggressively painted as the other woman by the tabloids, but you are here today supporting Spencer through this terrifying family crisis." Amanda nodded slowly, forcing a single perfect tear to roll down her cheek. She reached up and wiped it away with delicate precision. "It has been a living nightmare," Amanda replied, her voice trembling just the right amount to elicit sympathy from millions of viewers. "But Spencer and I truly love each other. We are trying to focus on the future and building a stable, loving environment for his boys when they are finally rescued from Natalie." Then Amanda did exactly what Patricia had ruthlessly coached her to do. She moved her hand from Spencer's arm and placed it gently over her slightly rounded stomach, rubbing it in slow, deliberate circles. In fact, Amanda continued, a soft maternal smile spreading across her face. "We wanted to share some hopeful light with the world today. Despite the darkness and the chaos Natalie has brought upon us, Spencer and I are expecting a child of our own. A true heir who will be raised with the love, stability, and strong family values that the corporate legacy represents." The anchor gasped in genuine surprise, immediately offering his warm congratulations on live television. The strategy was brilliantly wicked. By announcing the pregnancy on national television, Patricia was trying to publicly establish Amanda's unborn child as the legitimate backup plan for the $500 million trust fund. They were sending a clear message to the corporate board of directors that even if my twins were not recovered by Friday, the family lineage was still safely secured. They were making me and my children completely irrelevant to the narrative. I did not scream at the television. I did not throw my coffee mug against the wall. I simply picked up my highly secured laptop from the table and opened an encrypted email draft that Terrence and I had prepared the night before. Attached to the email was a single, highly confidential digital file. The recipient address belonged directly to the executive producer of the morning show. This was the person sitting in the control booth whose only job was to feed breaking news and explosive information directly into the earpiece of the anchor currently interviewing my husband. I watched Spencer smile softly at the camera, believing he had just won the ultimate public relations war and secured his massive inheritance. I rested my finger on the trackpad, took a deep breath, and pressed send. The encrypted file vanished from my screen, shooting through cyberspace directly into the secure server of the network control booth. As a corporate actuary, I rely on precise calculations and predictable timelines. I knew it would take a seasoned television producer exactly 12 seconds to open the leaked document, verify the digital signature of the medical facility, and feed the explosive information directly into the earpiece of their lead anchor. I sat back and counted those seconds in my head, while watching Spencer drone on about his deep family values. 8 seconds. 9 seconds. 10 seconds. At the 12th second, the veteran anchor suddenly stopped nodding. Her hand flew up to her ear. Her perfectly composed face shifted instantly from a sympathetic morning show host to a predator catching the scent of fresh blood. She glanced down at the digital tablet built into the glass desk in front of her. Her eyes quickly scanned the glowing screen, absorbing the absolute goldmine of a scandal that had just been dropped into her lap. Spencer was still talking, completely oblivious to the shift in the room. He was in the middle of a fabricated sentence about how Amanda was his absolute rock during this dark time. "Spencer, I'm going to have to interrupt you right there," the anchor said, her tone completely changing. The manufactured warmth was gone, replaced by razor-sharp journalistic precision. "We have just received a breaking document from a highly verified source regarding the claims you two just made on this stage." Spencer blinked, looking confused. Amanda suddenly froze. Her hand stopped rubbing her stomach, and her fake maternal smile completely vanished. "What kind of document?" Spencer asked, letting out a nervous little laugh. "Are there updates about my sons? Has Natalie been located?" The anchor looked directly at Amanda, her gaze completely merciless. "No, Spencer. This document is a non-invasive prenatal paternity test conducted at a private clinic in Beverly Hills just 2 weeks ago. The patient listed is Amanda." Amanda physically recoiled as if she had been slapped. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. She looked wildly off-camera toward the shadows where Patricia and her high-paid public relations team were undoubtedly standing in absolute horror. "That is highly confidential medical information," Amanda finally stammered, her voice pitching up in panic. "You cannot show that on television. It is a violation of my privacy." You just announced your pregnancy on a live national broadcast to millions of viewers, the anchor countered smoothly, not missing a single beat. You made your unborn child a matter of public interest. But according to these certified laboratory results, Spencer is not the biological father. The entire studio seemed to hold its collective breath. You could hear a pin drop through the television speakers. Spencer turned his head, slowly looking at Amanda, as if he had never seen her before in his life. The color completely drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly ashen gray. "What is she talking about?" Amanda, Spencer asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Tell her she is lying." The anchor did not wait for Amanda to formulate a lie. "The genetic markers are a 0% match for Spencer," the anchor read aloud, tapping her screen to emphasize the hard data. However, the document also includes a secondary comparative analysis that was requested by the patient. The confirmed biological father is listed as a man named Jason Reynolds. "Our producers have just confirmed that Jason Reynolds is currently employed as your private in-home personal trainer, Spencer." The fallout was instantaneous and utterly spectacular. Spencer leaped up from the sofa, knocking his microphone pack loose. He stared at the woman he had destroyed his marriage for, the woman who was supposed to magically secure his $500 million inheritance. Amanda shrank back against the cushions, holding her hands up defensively. "Spencer, please listen to me," Amanda cried out, her perfectly curated television persona completely shattering. It was just one mistake. "Jason was there when you were always working. You slept with Jason." Spencer screamed, completely forgetting that he was wearing a live microphone on national television. "In my own house, while my wife was pregnant with my actual children." Amanda reached out to grab his arm, but he violently shoved her away. The studio descended into pure chaos. The camera crew was scrambling. The executive producer was shouting faintly in the background. Amanda was sobbing hysterically, her lapel microphone cutting in and out with loud bursts of static as she grabbed at Spencer. Spencer was shouting profanities that the network censors were desperately trying to bleep out. The anchor looked straight into the main camera, completely unfazed. "It appears we are dealing with a rapidly developing family situation. We are going to cut to a quick commercial break, and we will be right back." The screen abruptly switched to a cheerful advertisement for laundry detergent. I sat back against the leather sofa in the quiet safety of the mountain cabin. The silence in the room was absolute bliss. The corporate empire was crumbling. The golden boy was humiliated, and the mistress was exposed. I picked up my mug from the coffee table, brought it to my lips, and took a slow, highly satisfying sip of my coffee. Terrence arrived at the safe house an hour later, holding a secure encrypted tablet. He did not even bother saying hello. He just handed me the screen. His private investigators had deep contacts within the television network, and they had immediately secured the backstage security footage from the morning show green room. I set my coffee down and watched the spectacular implosion of my husband and his mistress. The footage had audio, and it was glorious. Spencer was pacing the length of the luxurious dressing room, ripping off his silk tie and throwing it at the wall. He was screaming at Amanda, his face bright red, completely stripped of his polished corporate persona. He called her every terrible name in the book, blaming her for destroying his public image. Amanda was sitting on a velvet sofa, sobbing uncontrollably, her mascara running down her cheeks. She desperately tried to justify her betrayal, crying that Spencer was always working, always ignoring her, and that Jason, the personal trainer, actually paid attention to her. Spencer looked like he was going to break a lamp, but before he could, the heavy door to the green room flew open. Patricia stormed in like a hurricane of pure rage. She snapped her fingers, ordering her public relations team and the network staff to get out. The heavy door slammed shut, leaving the three of them alone. Patricia did not scream. She walked with terrifying calmness directly over to the velvet sofa. Amanda looked up, her face streaked with tears, opening her mouth to apologize. Patricia did not let her speak. She raised her hand and slapped Amanda across the face so hard the sound echoed sharply through the tablet speakers. Amanda cried out, falling sideways onto the cushions, clutching her stinging cheek. "You pathetic little parasite," Patricia hissed, her voice dripping with absolute venom. "You thought you could secure a piece of my empire by passing off a gym trainer's bastard as a legitimate heir. Take off the diamond necklace my son bought you. Take off the earrings. Leave the designer handbag on the table." Amanda sobbed, trembling, as she fumbled with the clasp of the expensive necklace. "Please, Patricia," Amanda begged. "I have nowhere to go. My apartment is in Spencer's name. I do not even have my own credit cards anymore." Patricia looked down at her with zero pity. "You have nothing because you are nothing," Patricia stated coldly. She turned to her massive security guard who had just stepped into the room. "Escort this trash out the back exit. Do not let her take a single item that my family paid for. Throw her directly onto the sidewalk." I watched the guard grab Amanda by the arm, hauling her up and dragging her out the door. She was still crying, begging Spencer to help her, but Spencer just turned his back. The mistress who had paraded around my hospital room 24 hours earlier was now penniless and standing on a New York sidewalk with nothing but the clothes on her back. But Patricia was not done. The second the door closed, she turned her wrath on her son. "You absolute imbecile," she barked at Spencer, poking him hard in the chest. "I paid $22 million to get rid of your wife because you could not keep your pants zipped. And you chose a scheming social media model who just made us the laughingstock of the entire country." Spencer buried his face in his hands, finally realizing the magnitude of his situation. "Mother, what are we going to do?" He panicked. "The board is already calling an emergency session. My 35th birthday is in 48 hours. If we do not have Natalie's twins back by Friday morning, the grandfather clause activates. The trust will default to the board, and they will vote us out of the company completely. We will lose the entire $500 million. Patricia began to pace the floor of the dressing room, her mind racing. She was cornered, bleeding money, and out of legal options. But Patricia was a woman who built her life on playing dirty when playing by the rules failed. She stopped pacing and looked at her son, her eyes narrowing into cold slits. "If we cannot find Natalie and physically take those babies by Friday, then we are going to change the reality of who those babies belong to," Patricia declared. Spencer looked confused. "What do you mean?" "They are my biological children." "Not if I say they are not," Patricia replied, pulling her phone from her pocket. She scrolled through her contacts. "I sit on the board of donors for the most prestigious medical facility in this state. I know a certain medical director who owes me a massive favor after I quietly paid off his offshore gambling debts last year. If Natalie will not give us the heirs, then I will have Dr. Ayers forge official medical documents proving that you are sterile and Natalie used a sperm donor. We will present the documents to the corporate board on Friday morning, invalidate her children, and buy ourselves enough legal time to secure a new surrogate." I handed the tablet back to Terrence, feeling a cold chill run down my spine. The hook was set, and the final desperate battle for the corporate empire had officially begun. Terrence took the tablet from my hands and immediately locked the screen. He did not look surprised by Patricia and her sudden pivot to medical forgery. In his years as a corporate attorney, he had seen billionaires commit far worse crimes to protect their wealth. But knowing her plan and proving it in front of a hostile board of directors were two entirely different battles. Terrence opened his briefcase and pulled out a thick file folder. He had not just intercepted the dressing room video, he had also tapped into the communication logs of the company executives. "Patricia has already scheduled the emergency shareholder meeting for 8 o'clock Friday morning," Terrence explained, spreading the documents across the wooden coffee table. "She is bringing Dr. Ayers as her star witness. They are drafting a massive legal injunction to present to the board. The narrative is that you defrauded her son, and that the twins have no biological claim to the grandfather clause. Once she presents those forged medical documents, she will demand an immediate board vote to restructure the trust management and solidify her position as chairwoman." I looked at the documents, feeling that cold chill turned into a burning, focused energy. Patricia was playing a desperate game while I was calculating a massive financial equation. I did not respond to Terrence right away. Instead, I walked over to the dining table where my secure laptop was set up. I opened my professional actuarial software. For the past 24 hours, the live television scandal had been doing exactly what I predicted it would do. The national broadcast featuring Spencer and his humiliated mistress had sent shockwaves through the financial sector. Investors absolutely hate family drama, especially when it involves the erratic behavior of the chief executive officer. I pulled up the live stock ticker for Patricia's Logistics Corporation. The line on the graph was a steep, terrifying plunge, colored in bright red. The stock had opened that morning down 18%. After the morning show aired, it dropped another 22%. Panic selling had taken over the market completely. Institutional investors were dumping their shares at rock-bottom prices just to distance themselves from the catastrophic public relations nightmare. I began running advanced risk assessment models, my fingers flying across the keyboard. I calculated the exact floor of the stock price, factoring in the panic, the impending emergency board meeting, and the overall liquidity of the available public shares. I ran simulations on how the market would react over the next 48 hours. The numbers crunched on the screen, verifying my initial theory. The company was bleeding out, and the shares were currently trading for absolute pennies on the dollar. I turned the laptop screen around so Terrence could see the glowing charts. Patricia is so obsessed with the grandfather clause and the private trust that she is completely ignoring the public vulnerability of her own corporation. I said, my voice steady and completely devoid of fear. She thinks she can fix this by simply presenting a forged piece of paper on Friday morning. She does not realize that her company is currently on sale to the highest bidder. Terrence looked at the numbers, his sharp legal mind instantly catching up to my financial strategy. A slow, incredibly dangerous smile spread across his face. He leaned over the table, studying the red lines crashing downward on the screen. "The $22 million," Terrence murmured softly, looking back at me. "It has been fully washed through the offshore shell accounts. It is completely clean and utterly untraceable to you." "Exactly," I replied, stepping closer to the table. Patricia handed me the exact capital I needed to execute a hostile takeover. "I need you to contact the proxy buyers we established in Delaware. Instruct them to start aggressively buying every single dumped share of Patricia's company on the open market. Do it quietly. Buy in small, scattered blocks through different corporate entities so you do not trigger any automated market alarms or alert the Securities Commission." Terrence nodded, already pulling out his encrypted phone to make the calls. He knew exactly which brokers to use to keep the transactions completely anonymous. "We have roughly 48 hours before the board meeting." He noted, his eyes locked on the plunging stock graph. "Can we secure enough public shares by then to actually make a difference against her private holdings?" I looked out the window at the quiet mountains, feeling an overwhelming sense of calm control. "We will buy the shares at their absolute lowest point right before the market closes on Thursday," I promised him. "Let Patricia spend the next 2 days foraging her little medical documents. Let her walk into that boardroom believing she has won the war, because by the time she stands up to speak on Friday morning, she will not be defending her empire. She will be standing in a company that I already own." Thursday night descended over Manhattan like a heavy, suffocating blanket. Inside Patricia and her luxurious penthouse overlooking Central Park, the atmosphere was thick with tension and the sharp smell of expensive scotch. Spencer was completely falling apart. He sat slumped on a velvet sofa, his tie undone, his eyes red and glassy from hours of heavy drinking. The golden boy of the family had been reduced to a pathetic, trembling shell. He kept muttering about the plummeting stock prices, the national embarrassment of his live television disaster, and the terrifying fact that his massive legacy was rapidly slipping through his fingers. He poured himself another glass of scotch, his hands shaking so violently that the amber liquid spilled over the crystal rim and stained the expensive Persian rug. Patricia completely ignored her son and his pathetic downward spiral. She sat at her massive glass dining table, illuminated by the harsh white glow of her laptop screen. Spread out before her were the forged medical documents she had just procured from Dr. Aries. They looked incredibly authentic, complete with official hospital letterheads, falsified laboratory stamps, and a perfectly fabricated medical narrative. The fake records detailed a long history of male infertility, explicitly stating that Spencer possessed a 0% chance of fathering biological children. According to the forged paperwork, the twins I had just delivered were the product of an anonymous sperm donor, completely voiding their claim to the grandfather clause of the $500 million trust. "Pull yourself together, Spencer," Patricia snapped without even looking up from the fraudulent papers. "You are acting like a weak child. Tomorrow morning you will walk into that boardroom with your head held high, and you will play the part of the deeply betrayed husband. You will let me do all the talking. Once the board sees these medical records, they will have no choice but to immediately sever Natalie and those babies from the family trust. I will secure the emergency restructuring vote, and we will walk out of that building with the entire company firmly in our grasp." Spencer took a messy gulp of his drink, coughing slightly as the alcohol burned his throat. "What if she shows up, Mother?" He slurred, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. "What if she brings her own lawyers to the meeting? She has Terrence on her side now. Terrence knows corporate law better than anyone in your entire legal department. What if they fight the medical records and the board believes them?" Patricia let out a cold, dismissive laugh. "Let her try," Patricia sneered, carefully placing the forged documents into a sleek leather presentation folder. "She is a disgraced runaway mother hiding in the shadows of some cheap motel. She does not have the resources or the authority to challenge a certified medical director in front of my executive board. In fact, I think it is time I remind her exactly who she is dealing with." Patricia reached for her phone, unlocking the screen with a sharp tap of her manicured fingernail. She wanted to twist the knife. She wanted to ensure that I spent the night shaking with fear. Patricia typed out a single venomous message. She did not care if my phone was being tracked or if Terrence was monitoring my communications. Her absolute arrogance blinded her to the very real danger she was currently in. She hit send, and the message flew through the cellular network. The text read, "You cannot hide forever. By tomorrow morning your kids will be legally recognized as bastards, and you will be left with nothing. See you in court." Miles away from the safe house in the Catskill Mountains, I felt my phone vibrate in my pocket. I was no longer hiding in the remote wilderness. I had quietly flown back into the city via helicopter earlier that evening, leaving the twins safely guarded by Terrence and his elite security team. The proxy buyers had successfully completed their aggressive purchasing sweep right before the market closed. I stood in the absolute silence of a massive empty room, letting the soft glow of the city streetlights illuminate the space around me. I pulled my phone from my pocket and read Patricia and her pathetic threat. A small, genuine smile touched my lips. She truly believed she held all the cards. I did not type out a long, angry reply. I did not try to defend the biological legitimacy of my children or threaten her with aggressive legal action. Instead, I simply raised my phone and opened the high-resolution camera application. I was standing at the head of a massive polished mahogany table. I aimed the camera lens directly at the heavy double oak doors at the far end of the room. The gold-plated corporate logo was gleaming in the dim security lighting. I took a clear, crisp photograph of the corporate boardroom doors from the inside. I attached the image to the text thread and hit send. Patricia thought she was preparing for a war tomorrow morning. She had no idea I was already sitting quietly inside the building, waiting for her to arrive. Friday morning arrived with a gray, overcast sky, casting long shadows across the Manhattan financial district. Inside the corporate headquarters, the atmosphere was electric with tension. The boardroom was a massive expanse of polished mahogany and floor-to-ceiling glass windows overlooking the city. By 7:45, the room slowly filled with the executive board of directors. These were mostly older, wealthy men in expensive, tailored suits. They were men who cared only about their stock portfolios and absolutely nothing about family loyalty. They took their respective seats at the massive table, murmuring anxiously to one another about the catastrophic stock plummet that had decimated their net worth over the past 48 hours. I watched them arrive through the frosted glass of the adjoining private executive lounge, where Terrence and I were comfortably waiting. Promptly at 8 o'clock, Patricia marched into the boardroom. She wore a sharp crimson designer suit, projecting an aura of absolute dominance. Spencer trailed behind her, looking like a man walking to his own execution. He kept his head down, avoiding the sharp, glaring eyes of the furious board members. Patricia took her place at the head of the long table, slamming her leather folder down with a sharp thud that instantly silenced the entire room. "Gentlemen," Patricia began, her voice projecting with practiced authority, "I called this emergency meeting because our company is facing an unprecedented public relations crisis orchestrated by a deeply unstable woman. But I am here to assure you that the family legacy and the $500 million trust remain entirely secure." A senior board member leaned forward, crossing his arms defensively. "The market does not look secure, Patricia," he stated coldly. "Your son made a total fool of himself on national television yesterday, and your daughter-in-law vanished with the sole heirs to the grandfather clause. If Spencer does not have legitimate biological children by midnight tonight, the board automatically takes control of the trust. Those are the ironclad rules your father established to protect this empire from incompetence." Patricia smiled a thin reptilian grin. That would be true if the children Natalie just delivered were actually Spencer's biological heirs. Patricia replied smoothly, opening her leather folder. She began distributing copies of the forged medical files, sliding them across the polished wood to the executives. "But they are not." The board members picked up the documents, adjusting their reading glasses. Patricia continued her completely fabricated narrative without a single ounce of hesitation. "As you can see from these certified medical records signed by Dr. Harris, the chief of reproductive medicine at our most prestigious hospital, my son Spencer has suffered from severe male infertility for years. He has a 0% chance of fathering biological children. Natalie knew about the stipulations of the family trust, and she used an anonymous sperm donor to secretly conceive those twins. She intended to pass them off as legitimate heirs to defraud this family and secure her own wealth." The men in the room gasped, flipping through the highly convincing pages. The forged hospital letterheads and falsified laboratory stamps looked incredibly authentic. Spencer stared blankly at the table, playing the part of the deeply humiliated victim, exactly as his mother had instructed him to do. He looked pathetic, but the board was buying the performance. Because these children are the product of an anonymous donor, they hold absolutely no legal claim to the grandfather clause, Patricia declared, her voice echoing triumphantly off the glass walls. "I am officially moving to invalidate their status as heirs to the trust. Furthermore, I am calling for an immediate board vote to grant me permanent emergency proxy over all corporate holdings, ensuring financial stability for our shareholders, and removing this toxic distraction from our narrative. We will find a suitable legal surrogate for Spencer soon, but today we must act to protect the company. All those in favor of restructuring the board under my absolute authority, please raise your hands." Several older men immediately began to raise their hands, eager to stop the financial bleeding, and side with the ruthless matriarch who promised them stability. They wanted the stock to rebound, and they did not care whose throat they had to step on to make it happen. But before a single vote could be officially tallied, the heavy oak doors at the back of the boardroom swung open with a massive, echoing crash. The board members abruptly lowered their hands and whipped their heads around in shock. Patricia froze her triumphant smile, completely dissolving into a look of absolute horror. Terrence walked into the room first, his presence commanding instant absolute silence. He was dressed in a pristine navy suit, carrying his signature black leather briefcase. And right behind him, I stepped confidently through the doorway. I was not hiding, and I was certainly not terrified. I wore a razor-sharp white-tailored suit, my heels clicking aggressively against the hardwood floor as I pushed a designer double stroller carrying the very heirs Patricia was just trying to erase. Security guards stationed at the corners of the massive boardroom immediately lunged forward. Patricia pointed a trembling, manicured finger at me, her face twisting in absolute outrage. "Get her out of here," Patricia screamed, her voice cracking with panic. "She is trespassing. She kidnapped my grandchildren. Restrain her and call the police immediately." The two largest guards reached out to grab my arms, but they never even made contact. Terrence stepped smoothly in front of the stroller, completely blocking their path. He did not raise his fists, Instead, he calmly unbuttoned his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a crisp document stamped with a heavy blue federal seal. He held it up high enough for the entire executive board to see. "Touch my client or her children, and you will be immediately arrested for violating a federal court injunction." Terrence warned, his deep voice echoing with absolute authority. "We are here under the direct protection of a United States federal judge. Step back." The security guards froze instantly, recognizing the heavy blue seal. They backed away, leaving Terrence and me standing completely unopposed at the end of the long mahogany table. Patricia realized her physical intimidation tactic had failed, so she quickly pivoted back to her forged paperwork. She slammed her hand down on the falsified medical records scattered across the table. "You are too late, Natalie," Patricia sneered, trying to regain control of the room. "You can bring a lawyer, but you cannot change the facts. We already have the certified medical records proving those children do not belong to Spencer. We know you used an anonymous sperm donor to defraud this family. You have absolutely no legal claim to the grandfather clause, and the board is voting to restructure the trust right now." I stopped the designer stroller at the opposite end of the table and locked the wheels. The twins were sleeping soundly, completely unaware of the corporate bloodbath happening around them. I looked at the old, arrogant men staring at me. Then I looked at Spencer, who was visibly shaking in his expensive leather chair. I reached into my sophisticated designer diaper bag. I did not pull out a bottle or a pacifier. I pulled out a thick, tamper-evident envelope bearing the official seal of the Federal Bureau of Investigation Forensic Laboratory. I tossed the heavy envelope right down the center of the polished wooden table. It slid perfectly, stopping just inches away from Patricia and her forged papers. "I am a corporate actuary, Patricia," I said, my voice cutting through the heavy tension of the room like a perfectly sharpened blade. "I assessed risk for a living, and marrying into your highly toxic family was the biggest risk of my entire life. I knew you would try to steal my children the second they were born, so I took the necessary precautions to completely neutralize your strategy." I looked directly at the senior executive board member sitting near the envelope. "Open it," I instructed him calmly. On the day of my delivery, I formally requested a federally supervised DNA collection. The chief hospital administrator oversaw the swabbing of my twins under the watchful eye of a court-appointed federal marshal. It was not conducted by Patricia and her private gambling-addicted doctor. It was processed by a federal laboratory. The senior board member nervously picked up the envelope, broke the tamper-evidence seal, and pulled out the crisp official document. The room was so quiet you could hear the paper rustle. "Read the results aloud," Terrence commanded, stepping forward to stand shoulder to shoulder with me. The board member cleared his throat, his eyes scanning the irrefutable genetic data. "Probability of paternity is 99.9%. The executive read aloud, his voice echoing off the glass walls. "Spencer is conclusively the biological father of both male infants." Spencer buried his face in his hands, letting out a pathetic whimper. The board members erupted into angry murmurs, realizing they had almost been tricked into voting on fraudulent grounds. Terrence pulled a secondary file from his briefcase and dropped it onto the table. Furthermore, Terrence announced loudly the medical director who signed Patricia and her fake documents. Dr. Aris was taken into federal custody just 1 hour ago for wire fraud and medical malpractice. He immediately confessed to forging those fertility records in exchange for Patricia secretly paying off his massive offshore gambling debts. The entire executive board turned to glare at Patricia. She had just exposed the company to a massive federal investigation. She was backed into an absolute corner, but the ruthless matriarch still refused to surrender. Her face contorted with pure desperate rage. She slammed both of her hands on the table, leaning forward like a cornered predator. "Fine," Patricia sneered, her voice shrill and dripping with venom. "They are his, which means they belong to the trust, and I am the conservator." "Fine," Patricia sneered, her voice shrill and dripping with venom. "They are his, which means they belong to the trust, and I am the conservator." I smiled. It was not a small, polite smile, but a genuine expression of absolute victory. I turned my back on Patricia for a brief moment, projecting total unbothered confidence. I walked over to the edge of the table and unlatched the heavy brass locks of the sleek leather briefcase Terrence had carried in for me. I reached inside and pulled out a fragile, yellowed stack of papers. The document was bound by a thick, faded silk ribbon and sealed with the original cracked wax stamp of the family patriarch. This was not a digital copy or a recently amended corporate summary that Patricia liked to manipulate. This was the original foundational document of the $500 million trust written in 1980. I placed the heavy parchment gently onto the center of the polished mahogany table. I am not sure if you actually read your father and his foundational legal documents, Patricia, I said, my voice perfectly level as I carefully untied the old ribbon, or if you just assume your immense wealth allows you to rewrite the rules whenever they no longer suit your current narrative. But as a corporate actuary, I read absolutely everything. I study the footnotes. I analyze the deep historical data, and I pay special attention to the hidden clauses that outline absolute catastrophic risk. I opened the heavy cover and flipped past the first dozen pages. The board members leaned forward in their expensive leather chairs, their eyes glued to the ancient paper. Patricia scoffed loudly, rolling her eyes, but I could see the sudden sharp uncertainty flickering behind her aggressive posture. Your father was an incredibly strict man. I continued tracing my index finger down the thick parchment until I found the exact paragraph I was looking for. He built this massive empire from absolutely nothing, and he actively despised moral failure. He specifically designed this trust to protect the family assets from reckless, irresponsible heirs who could not control their own basic impulses, which brings us directly to Section 4, subsection B. Terrence stepped forward, his powerful presence commanding the room. Allow me to translate the archaic legalese for the executive board, Terrence offered, looking directly at the senior executives who held the company purse strings. Clause 4b explicitly outlines the guardianship of all infant shares in the event of a documented marital dissolution. It states that if the male heir, in this case Spencer, commits documented marital infidelity, he immediately and permanently forfeits all proxy and voting rights attached to his minor children and their inherited corporate shares. Patricia opened her mouth to argue, but Terrence cut her off before she could even form a syllable. Those voting rights do not revert to the corporate board, Terrence stated firmly, his voice leaving no room for debate, and they absolutely do not revert to the grandmother. The clause dictates that the voting rights default entirely to the primary legal guardian of the infant heirs, because Natalie filed for an at-fault divorce. First, that sole guardian is their biological mother. Patricia slammed her hands flat on the table again, her face turning a dangerous shade of red. You have no proof of infidelity that this board recognizes, she desperately argued, pointing a shaking finger at me. A few text messages and hotel receipts do not constitute a legal breach of the trust. I will tie you up in litigation for a decade before I let you touch those shares. I looked at her, genuinely amazed by her sheer delusion. Patricia, I replied smoothly, tilting my head, did you happen to watch national television yesterday morning? Spencer suddenly let out a sharp, audible gasp. He gripped the edge of the mahogany table so hard his knuckles turned completely white. His eyes started frantically from his furious mother to the ancient document resting calmly in front of me. Terrence reached into his jacket and tossed a certified legal transcript of the morning show broadcast right next to the trust document. Your son went on a live national broadcast. I reminded the silent room, projecting my voice so every single executive could hear me. He sat next to his pregnant mistress. He publicly admitted to an ongoing romantic affair. He confirmed his adultery on camera to an audience of millions of viewers. And then, in a spectacular twist of fate, the entire world watched as he discovered his mistress was actually sleeping with his personal trainer. It was not just a massive public relations disaster. It was a globally broadcast, undeniable, legally binding confession of marital infidelity. The executives at the table began to murmur urgently among themselves. The senior board member who had just read the DNA results picked up a copy of the current corporate bylaws, frantically cross-referencing the old trust document with their modern operating procedures. He looked up, his face completely pale. She is right. The senior member announced, his voice echoing in the massive room. According to the foundational charter, the mother currently holds the proxy. I looked down at Spencer. He was staring blankly at the floor, breathing heavily, completely paralyzed by the terrifying realization of what he had just done. He had gone on television to secure his inheritance, to paint himself as the victim and solidify his standing with the board. Instead, his desperate attempt to control the public narrative had triggered the exact legal trap I needed to destroy him. By publicly confessing to his affair, Spencer had just legally handed me complete, unchecked control over his children and their massive shares in the company. Patricia stood frozen at the head of the table. The color had completely washed out of her face, but the ruthless businesswoman inside her refused to die quietly. She took a deep breath, smoothing the front of her crimson designer suit, and forcibly hardened her expression. She looked around the boardroom, calculating the numbers in her head with the speed of a seasoned corporate predator. "So you have the proxy," Patricia finally said, her voice dripping with absolute condescension. "Congratulations, Natalie. You managed to outsmart my idiot son and secure the trust fund shares. But you are clearly forgetting how the corporate structure of this company actually works. Those infant shares only represent 15% of the total voting power. I still personally hold 40% of the company stock." She gestured proudly to the older men sitting around the mahogany table. "The remaining 45% is distributed among the executive board members sitting in this very room." Patricia continued, her confidence rapidly returning. "Men who have partnered with my family for decades. Men who will gladly align their votes with mine to crush a rogue outsider who thinks she can walk in here and dictate terms. You have 15%, Natalie. I have the majority. I still run this empire, and my first official act will be to bury you in so much corporate litigation that your grandchildren will be paying the legal fees." I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice or argue with her desperate mathematics. I simply looked at Terrence and gave him a slight nod. Terrence unclasped the second compartment of his leather briefcase. He pulled out a thick stack of freshly printed financial ledgers, bound in heavy black plastic. He began walking down the length of the long table, dropping a copy of the ledger in front of every single executive board member. "What you are currently holding is the updated and fully certified shareholder registry," Terrence announced, his deep voice commanding the absolute attention of the room. "It was officially filed with the Securities and Exchange Commission at precisely 7 o'clock this morning. I highly suggest you turn to page 4 and review the newly recorded majority distributions." Patricia snatched a copy of the registry from the hands of the executive sitting nearest to her. "What is this nonsense?" she demanded, frantically flipping through the pages. "You cannot alter the shareholder registry without a formal board vote. You cannot alter private executive shares without a vote." I corrected her, taking a slow, deliberate step toward her end of the table. "But the public shares are entirely at the mercy of the open market. And your open market, Patricia, has been an absolute bloodbath for the past 48 hours. The senior executive board member ran his finger down the column of numbers on page 4. His eyes widened in absolute shock. "The public shares," he whispered, his voice trembling. "Over the last 2 days, someone has been aggressively buying up every single dumped share on the open market through a network of blind limited liability companies." "Exactly," Terrence confirmed, resting his hands on the back of an empty leather chair. When Spencer humiliated himself on live television, the corporate stock price plummeted to historic lows. Institutional investors panicked and dumped millions of shares for pennies on the dollar. Those shares were quietly purchased by a highly organized network of proxy buyers based in Delaware. Patricia stared at the ledger, her hands shaking violently. "Who owns those companies?" she demanded, looking up at the board. "Which one of our competitors orchestrated this?" "I own them, Patricia," I stated clearly, my voice ringing through the silent boardroom. Patricia let out a harsh, breathless laugh. "That is completely impossible," she snapped. "Buying that much equity would require tens of millions of dollars in liquid capital. You are a middle-class actuary, Natalie. You do not have that kind of money." I smiled warmly at her. "I did not have that kind of money until Wednesday night, Patricia. But then my incredibly generous mother-in-law handed me an irrevocable certified wire transfer for exactly $22 million. The entire boardroom gasped. Spencer buried his head in his arms, groaning loudly in absolute despair. He finally understood the massive, catastrophic scale of his mother and her arrogance. "You funded your own hostile takeover," Terrence explained, a cruel, victorious smile playing on his lips. "You gave my client $22 million in clean liquid capital. She immediately leveraged that money during the historic stock crash you created." Through her proxy buyers, Natalie successfully acquired 36% of the outstanding corporate stock. I walked right up to Patricia, looking her dead in the eye. "I am a numbers person, Patricia," I said softly. "Let us do the final math together. I hold the 15% proxy from the grandfather clause. My private holding companies just acquired 36% of the public shares. 15 plus 36 equals 51. The heavy silence in the boardroom was completely deafening. The wealthy, arrogant men who had planned to vote against me just minutes ago were now staring at me in absolute terror. 51%, I repeated, letting the number hang in the air. "I am now the majority shareholder of this entire empire. I do not need the board to vote with me, Patricia. I own the board, and I own you." The boardroom exploded into absolute chaos. Several senior executives jumped out of their leather chairs, shouting over each other in a deafening chorus of panic and outrage. Patricia lost whatever tiny shred of aristocratic composure she had left. She slammed both of her fists violently onto the mahogany table, knocking over a crystal water pitcher. The heavy glass shattered onto the hardwood floor, sending cold water pooling around her designer heels. "You cannot do this!" Patricia screamed at the top of her lungs. Her face contorted into a mask of pure desperation. "This is an illegal, hostile takeover. You violated federal securities laws. I will have the Securities and Exchange Commission freeze every single one of those shell companies before lunch. You are going to federal prison, Natalie." Terrence stepped forward smoothly, completely unbothered by her hysterical screaming. He did not raise his voice, but his deep baritone cut through the panic like a sharpened blade. He opened his briefcase and pulled out a thin black legal binder. "Actually, Patricia," Terrence said, calmly handing the binder directly to the senior board member. "The acquisitions were perfectly legal and entirely above board. We filed the Schedule 13D with the Securities and Exchange Commission. The exact second our proxy buyers crossed the mandatory 5% ownership threshold, we adhered strictly to the Williams Act and all Delaware corporate law precedents regarding open market acquisitions. You cannot freeze legal market trades just because you were too arrogant to monitor your own fluctuating stock." Patricia pointed a shaking, heavily manicured finger at Terrence. She was hyperventilating her chest, heaving with every jagged breath. "You are a criminal accomplice," she snarled. "You used insider information to manipulate the market. That is a federal crime, Terrence. I will see you permanently disbarred and thrown in a federal penitentiary for the rest of your pathetic life." Terrence just laughed his deep, rich, victorious laugh. "Insider information," he echoed, shaking his head in absolute amusement. "Patricia, your golden boy's son, went on national television yesterday morning and announced a major shift in the family trust by declaring his young mistress pregnant. Your company's stock plummeted specifically based on that highly public, globally broadcast interview. Natalie simply analyzed the public reaction and bought the massive dip. That is not insider trading, Patricia. That is just brilliant risk management, executed by a superior actuary." The board members realized Terrence was absolutely right. The senior executive closed the black legal binder and looked at Patricia with absolute, unhidden disgust. "You played us, Patricia," he said, his voice shaking with sheer anger. "You brought forged medical documents to this executive board to try and steal a family trust fund while your own company was being aggressively bought out right from under us. You have completely compromised this entire corporation and destroyed our shareholder value." The other wealthy men in the room began to nod in aggressive agreement, actively distancing themselves from the sinking ship. I looked at Patricia. She was standing at the head of the table, clinging to the back of the heavy leather chair as if it were a life raft. "That is my chair, Patricia," I said quietly, my voice slicing through the remaining anxious murmurs in the room. "You called this emergency meeting to restructure the board under a new ultimate authority. You just did not realize who that absolute authority was going to be. Now step away from my seat." Patricia refused to move. Her eyes were wild with sheer disbelief and desperation. "I built this company," she whispered, her voice cracking pathetically. "I gave my entire life to this massive empire. You are a nobody. You are just a middle-class gold digger who got incredibly lucky." I took a slow, deliberate step toward her. "I am the majority shareholder," I reminded her, my tone absolutely freezing. "And you are currently trespassing in my boardroom." I looked over at the two massive security guards standing near the large oak doors, the exact same guards Patricia had ordered to violently remove me just 20 minutes ago. "Escort her out of my chair," I commanded them. The guards hesitated for only a fraction of a second. They looked at the senior board members, who nodded in silent, immediate agreement. The guards stepped forward and grabbed Patricia by her arms, pulling her roughly away from the head of the table. She thrashed against them, screaming obscenities, but they held her firmly in place. I walked past her, smoothly adjusting the lapels of my tailored white suit. I reached the head of the massive mahogany table. I pulled out the heavy leather executive chair and sat down. It was surprisingly comfortable. I looked down the long length of the table. Spencer was staring at me with wide, terrified eyes. Patricia was panting, heavily held back by her own security team. The executive board members were sitting in absolute stunned silence, waiting for my next move. I folded my hands neatly on top of the polished wood right next to the original trust document. "Let us officially call this emergency shareholder meeting back to order," I announced, projecting my voice with absolute calm authority. "As the newly established majority owner, I am introducing my first official corporate resolution. I am calling for an immediate board vote on the permanent termination of Patricia and Spencer from all executive leadership roles within this corporation. Effective immediately, they will be stripped of their corporate titles, their company assets, and their access to all corporate facilities. Furthermore, due to their gross negligence and attempted fraud involving forged medical documents, this termination will be executed with absolute cause, meaning they will receive 0 severance packages." Who seconds the motion? "I second the motion," the senior executive board member announced without a single second of hesitation. He raised his hand high in the air. Within moments, every single hand around the massive mahogany table shot up in absolute unison. The vote was entirely unanimous. The wealthy, arrogant men who had coddled Spencer and bowed to Patricia for decades were now practically tripping over themselves to sever ties and protect their own remaining stock values. They recognized the new ultimate authority in the room, and they were desperate to prove their loyalty to me. The reality of the unanimous vote hit Spencer like a physical blow. He shot up from his leather chair, his knees trembling beneath his tailored trousers. He looked wildly around the boardroom, realizing that not a single person in this massive glass tower was going to save him. The board members actively avoided his gaze, staring down at their legal binders instead. So, Spencer did exactly what cowards always do when they are backed into a corner. He turned on the person standing closest to him. "Natalie, please," Spencer begged, his voice cracking as he stumbled clumsily toward my end of the table. "You cannot do this to me. I am the father of your children. I was manipulated into all of this. I never wanted to take the boys away from you. It was all her idea." Spencer pointed a trembling finger directly at his mother. Patricia, who was still being restrained by the security guards, stared at her golden boy in absolute horrified silence. The betrayal was so sudden and so vicious that she actually stopped struggling. "She forced me to go on that morning television show," Spencer cried out desperately, throwing his own mother entirely under the bus in front of the executive board. "She is the one who hired the private investigators to track you down. She is the one who explicitly bribed Dr. Eris to forge those medical records and fake my infertility today. I told her it was a terrible criminal plan, but she threatened to cut off my trust fund allowance if I did not play along. She is the mastermind, Natalie, not me. You have to believe me. Patricia let out a strangled, agonizing gasp. After spending her entire life spoiling him, elevating him and protecting him from the consequences of his own disastrous actions, her perfect son had completely betrayed her. The second his own comfort was threatened. You ungrateful little coward, Patricia hissed, her voice venomous but broken. I did everything for you. I sat perfectly still in the heavy leather executive chair. I did not feel a single ounce of pity for either of them. I looked at Spencer, analyzing him not as a husband or a father, but strictly as a failed corporate investment. You turned 35 years old tomorrow, Spencer, I said, my voice dropping to a cold, clinical tone that echoed off the glass walls. Let us do a quick actuarial calculation of your actual worth. You just lost your executive salary and your massive annual corporate bonus. Because you publicly admitted to infidelity on national television, you completely voided your access to the grandfather clause. Because you are being terminated with absolute cause today, you receive no golden parachute and no severance package. Spencer stopped walking, his mouth hanging slightly open as the catastrophic financial math washed over him. Your luxury penthouse and your imported vehicles are all listed as corporate assets, which means the company is legally repossessing them this afternoon. I continued, my voice completely devoid of emotion. You have zero personal savings because you spent your entire adult life living off your mother and her corporate expense accounts. The credit cards in your wallet are tied to the corporate accounts which Terrence already froze 10 minutes ago. Your mistress drained whatever loose cash you had left hiding in your private safe. So mathematically speaking, Spencer, your exact net worth right at this very second is absolute zero. You bring nothing of value to this company, and you bring absolutely nothing of value to my children. Spencer fell to his knees right there on the polished hardwood floor. He was openly sobbing, burying his face in his hands and begging me to give him a second chance. He begged the board members to intervene, but the old executives just looked away, completely disgusted by his pathetic display. I looked past him toward the massive double oak doors. I made eye contact with the lead security guard. Escort the former executive out of my building, I ordered calmly. Remove his corporate key cards and ensure he does not take a single piece of company property with him. The two massive guards released Patricia and immediately advanced on Spencer. They grabbed him by his expensive suit jacket, hauling him roughly to his feet. Spencer thrashed and kicked, screaming my name and begging for mercy, but the guards were completely merciless. They dragged the weeping golden boy backward out of the boardroom and down the long glass hallway. Terrence walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window, looking down at the street level far below. He checked his watch and smiled a highly satisfied smile. Right on schedule, Terrence murmured softly. I did not need to look out the window to know exactly what was waiting for my husband down on the sidewalk. Terrence had anonymously tipped off the major tabloid networks 30 minutes ago. When the security guards pushed Spencer through the front lobby doors and threw him onto the hard concrete of the New York street, a massive swarm of paparazzi was already waiting. The camera flashes fired like rapid lightning, capturing every single humiliating angle of the ruined billionaire golden boy, as he wept alone on the sidewalk with absolutely nothing to his name. While the paparazzi were tearing Spencer apart down on the street level, I turned my attention to the final loose end of this corporate war. The lead security guard approached me in the boardroom, his radio buzzing quietly. He informed me that Patricia had managed to break away from her escorts and had locked herself inside the massive corner executive suite on the top floor. She was violently refusing to leave the premises and was demanding to speak to her private legal team. The guards asked if I wanted them to breach the doors and physically remove her. I shook my head, holding up my hand. I told them to wait by the elevators. I wanted to handle my mother-in-law completely alone. I walked down the long carpeted hallway, feeling the immense quiet of the executive floor. I reached the heavy double mahogany doors of the chief executive officer's suite. Using my newly activated master keycard, I swiped the lock. The green light flashed, and the heavy doors clicked open. I stepped into the sprawling office. The room was a monument to Patricia and her massive ego, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of the entire Manhattan skyline. Patricia was standing behind her massive marble desk, frantically shoving files into a heavy industrial paper shredder. She spun around when she heard the door close, her eyes completely wild with panic and rage. "Get out of my office," Patricia hissed, her voice raw and scratching against her throat. "You may have manipulated the board today, Natalie, but you have not won. Do you really think I am just going to pack up my things and walk away from my empire? I have an army of the most vicious corporate lawyers in this country on retainer. I will tie you up in civil litigation for the next 3 decades. I will sue you for corporate espionage, market manipulation, and emotional distress. I will bury you in so many injunctions that your grandchildren will inherit nothing but massive legal debts." I walked slowly across the expensive Persian rug, not reacting to a single word of her desperate threats. I stopped right in front of her marble desk. I reached out and calmly pressed the power button on her industrial shredder, silencing the loud grinding noise. "Patricia," I said softly, crossing my arms, "you are making the exact same mistake you made in my hospital room. You are treating me like an emotional opponent instead of a financial actuary. You think I spent the last 48 hours just buying up your company's stock? But I actually spent most of my time doing what I do best. I audited your personal accounts." Patricia stiffened her hand, hovering nervously over a stack of shredded documents. "What are you talking about?" she demanded, her voice losing a fraction of its aggressive edge. "My personal accounts are secured behind layers of private wealth management. You have no access to them." I did not need direct access. I explained, my tone completely clinical. "I just needed the routing numbers from the massive transaction you initiated on Wednesday night. When you wired me $22 million in the middle of the night, you used a priority routing protocol. You claimed the money came from your primary holding account, but as an actuary, I am trained to spot financial anomalies. I trace the origin of those liquid funds backward through the offshore logistics subsidiary you bragged about." Patricia suddenly stopped breathing. The color drained from her face, leaving her looking incredibly old and fragile. She slowly lowered her hands to the marble desk, leaning heavily against it, as if her legs could no longer support her weight. "That $22 million did not come from your personal trust fund." I continued, stepping closer so she could hear every single devastating word. "You did not have the liquid cash available to buy my children, so you stole it. You ordered your wealth manager to quietly siphon those funds directly from the corporate employee pension fund. You embezzled $22 million from the retirement savings of thousands of hardworking middle-class employees just to fund your own selfish family agenda. It was just a temporary loan." Patricia whispered, her voice trembling violently. "I was going to replace the funds as soon as the stock bounced back. You cannot prove I took it intentionally." "I already proved it," I countered sharply. "Terrence possesses the entire digitized financial trail. He compiled a massive evidence packet detailing your wire fraud, grand larceny, and gross violations of federal pension protection laws. Stealing from a corporate pension is not a civil dispute, Patricia. It is a massive federal crime. The Department of Justice will not just fine you. They will parade you in handcuffs on national television and lock you in a federal penitentiary for the rest of your natural life." Patricia collapsed backward into her leather executive chair, completely shattered. She covered her mouth with her trembling hands, tears of absolute defeat finally spilling over her perfectly manicured cheeks. "I am going to give you exactly one choice, Patricia," I said, looking down at her broken form. "You will stand up right now. You will walk out of this office leaving your car keys, your corporate credit cards, and every single piece of company property on this desk. You will walk away with absolutely nothing. If you agree to surrender quietly and never challenge my authority again, Terrence will keep the embezzlement files permanently locked in his vault. But if you try to fight me, if you make even one single phone call to your lawyers, I will personally hand that packet to the federal authorities before the sun goes down." Patricia looked up at me, her eyes completely hollow. She knew she was beaten. She slowly stood up, removed her expensive corporate keycard from her pocket, and dropped it onto the marble desk. Without saying another word, the ruined matriarch turned and walked out the door. As the heavy mahogany door clicked shut behind the ruined matriarch, I finally allowed myself to exhale. The office was entirely mine. The empire was completely under my control. But my risk assessment was not quite finished. There was still one tiny, unpredictable variable left out in the open, and I do not like leaving loose ends. Across town, in a completely different world, Amanda was frantically trying to salvage her own ruined life. After Patricia had her physically thrown onto the street with absolutely nothing, Amanda had dragged her suitcase into a cheap, crowded diner in Brooklyn. She was sitting in a sticky vinyl booth across from a sleazy tabloid reporter. She was desperate. She had just lost her billionaire golden boy and the luxurious lifestyle she felt entitled to. So she decided to play her final card. She was trying to sell her exclusive story to the highest bidder. "I know all of their dirty secrets," Amanda bragged, leaning over the diner table and aggressively stirring her cheap coffee. "I was inside the hospital room when Patricia tried to bribe Natalie. I know about the massive trust fund and the grandfather clause. My story is worth at least $500,000. I will give your magazine the absolute exclusive rights, but I need a cash advance wired to my account by the end of the day." The reporter looked eager, his eyes lighting up at the prospect of the massive corporate scandal. He reached into his jacket to pull out a standard non-disclosure and exclusivity contract. But before he could even uncap his pen, a tall, imposing figure stepped right up to their booth, completely blocking the harsh fluorescent lighting of the diner. It was Terrence. He looked entirely out of place in the rundown restaurant, wearing his pristine navy suit and carrying his signature black leather briefcase. He did not ask for permission to join them. He simply slid into the booth, right next to the terrified reporter. "I would strongly advise against signing any contracts with this young woman." Terrence said, his deep voice completely calm, but laced with absolute menace. "Unless your tabloid publication is prepared to be named as a CO defendant in a massive corporate embezzlement lawsuit." The reporter froze, instantly recognizing the high-powered corporate attorney. He shoved his contract back into his jacket and practically scrambled out of the booth, completely abandoning Amanda. "Wait!" Amanda cried out, reaching across the table. "We had a deal. You promised me a cash advance." But the reporter was already sprinting out the front door of the diner, wanting absolutely nothing to do with Terrence or his massive legal threats. Amanda turned her fury on Terrence. "What are you doing here?" She shrieked, her voice cracking with sheer desperation. "You already ruined Spencer. You already got what you wanted. Leave me alone. I have a right to sell my own life story. You have the right to remain completely silent." Terrence corrected her, snapping the brass locks of his briefcase open. He pulled out a massive stack of legal documents bound with a thick rubber band and dropped it squarely onto the sticky diner table. "I am not here to talk about your fictional life story, Amanda. I am here representing the new majority shareholder of the Logistics Corporation, and we are here to collect our stolen property." Amanda stared at the legal documents, her face turning completely pale. "What property?" she stammered defensively. "I do not have anything. Patricia made me leave the jewelry and the bags in the dressing room yesterday. I am totally broke." Terrence smiled a cold, calculating smile. "You left the jewelry Spencer bought you yesterday," Terrence corrected her. "But over the last 12 months, Spencer leased a luxury apartment in your name. He bought you a brand new imported sports car. He funded your lavish vacations and paid off your massive credit card debts. You assumed he was spending his own personal wealth. He was not. Spencer illegally used corporate expense accounts to fund his marital infidelity. Every single dollar he spent on you belonged to the company." Amanda physically shrank back into the vinyl booth, realizing the terrifying gravity of his words. Because Spencer was terminated with absolute cause for gross negligence and embezzlement, the corporation is legally initiating a full clawback of all stolen assets, Terrence explained, tapping the stack of legal papers. This is a civil suit demanding the immediate return of $450,000 in stolen corporate funds. Our private recovery agents are currently at your apartment seizing the imported car and changing the locks. Your credit cards have been officially frozen by the banking institutions. Amanda began to openly weep, her carefully constructed social media facade completely crumbling. I do not have $400,000. She sobbed, covering her face with her hands. I am pregnant. I have absolutely nowhere to go. You have exactly 30 days to vacate the corporate lease department and surrender any remaining assets bought with stolen funds, Terrence stated, standing up from the booth and smoothing his suit jacket. If you fail to comply, we will pursue criminal charges for possession of stolen corporate property. Have a wonderful afternoon, Amanda. Terrence turned and walked out of the diner, leaving the ruined mistress entirely alone. Amanda sat in the sticky booth staring at the massive lawsuit. She pulled out her phone, her hands shaking violently. She had no billionaire boyfriend. She had no luxury apartment. She had absolutely no money. Weeping uncontrollably, she scrolled down to her contacts and dialed the only number she had left. She called her parents in New Jersey, sobbing into the receiver and begging them to let her move back into their damp, cramped basement. With Amanda completely neutralized and Patricia permanently removed from the premises, the top floor of the corporate headquarters fell into a strange and absolute silence. I sat alone in the massive leather chair behind the marble desk, looking out through the floor-to-ceiling windows at the sprawling Manhattan skyline. I had won the war. I possessed 51% of a massive logistics empire. But as the adrenaline slowly faded from my bloodstream, the cold, hard logic of my profession took over once again. I am an actuary. I measure risk, calculate longevity, and maximize guaranteed returns. And looking around this opulent office, I realized I had absolutely no desire to run this company. This corporation was built on decades of toxic manipulation, family betrayal, and corporate embezzlement. The board members who had just enthusiastically voted with me were the exact same men who had enabled Patricia for years. If I stayed, I would have to spend the next 20 years of my life fighting off their relentless corporate politics. I would be tied to this desk, separated from my newborn twins, constantly defending my position. I did not want to inherit Patricia and her poisoned legacy. I wanted to completely dismantle it. I opened my highly encrypted laptop and pulled up a private contact file Terrence had prepared for me weeks ago. I bypassed the corporate switchboard entirely and dialed a direct private number. The phone rang twice before it was answered. Harrison called, well, speaking, a sharp, gravelly voice answered. Harrison was the chief executive officer of Vanguard Global Shipping, the largest and most aggressive direct competitor to Patricia and her company. For years, Vanguard had tried to penetrate our market share, and for years, Patricia had fiercely blocked them at every single turn. Harrison, this is Natalie, I said, my voice projecting absolute confidence. We have never formally met, but I am sure you have been closely monitoring the public relations disaster surrounding my husband and his mother this week. I heard a low chuckle on the other end of the line. I have been watching the stock ticker, Natalie. Your family is having a very bad week. If you are calling to beg for a corporate merger to stop the financial bleeding, you are wasting my time. I plan to let your stock hit rock bottom and then buy the scraps for pennies. I am not calling to beg, Harrison, I replied, leaning back in the heavy leather chair. And you are not talking to a desperate family member. You are talking to the newly established majority shareholder. I currently possess 51% of the total voting stock. I just fired Patricia and Spencer with absolute cause, and I have the entire executive board firmly under my heel. I hold the absolute keys to the kingdom. The line went completely quiet. The arrogant amusement instantly vanished from his voice. I am listening, Harrison said carefully. I do not want to run this toxic empire, I explained, resting my hand on the smooth marble desk. I want pure liquid freedom. I am offering you my entire 51% controlling stake. You will get the exclusive shipping routes, the international port contracts, and the massive fleet of cargo vessels Patricia spent her entire life hoarding. But you are not going to buy it at the current crashed market price. You are going to pay me a 20% premium above the valuation from exactly 1 week ago before the television scandal even happened. That is an astronomical amount of cash, Harrison argued quickly. You are asking for hundreds of millions of dollars in a completely unverified private buyout. I'm offering you the absolute destruction of your biggest rival. I countered, my tone completely ruthless. You will absorb the entire infrastructure overnight. The return on investment will completely eclipse the premium within 2 fiscal quarters. You have exactly 1 hour to accept my terms and initiate the corporate buyout protocols. If you hesitate, I will hang up this phone and make the exact same offer to the massive overseas conglomerate that has been desperately trying to break into the American shipping market. The clock starts right now, Harrison. I did not even wait for his response. I disconnected the line. Exactly 42 minutes later, my phone rang. It was Harrison. Send the contracts to my legal team immediately, he commanded. We have a deal. Terrence finalized the massive corporate transaction over the next 48 hours. I traded my 51% controlling stake for an obscene amount of guaranteed liquid cash. I walked out of the corporate headquarters on Monday morning, an extraordinarily wealthy woman, completely untethered from the toxic family that had tried to destroy me. But the most satisfying moment did not come from checking my bank account. It came 3 days later when I turned on the local news. Vanguard Global Shipping had wasted absolutely no time asserting their new total dominance. A news helicopter was broadcasting live footage hovering over the corporate headquarters. A massive construction crane was currently lifting the giant gold letters of Patricia and her family name off the side of the skyscraper. One by one, the letters were violently ripped from the glass facade and lowered to the ground. Within hours, the building was completely rebranded, erasing Patricia and her family legacy from the New York skyline forever. The corporate war was over, but the personal legal battles were just concluding. 2 weeks after the massive corporate buyout, I found myself sitting in a sterile, brightly lit courtroom in downtown Manhattan. This family court hearing was the final step in completely severing my ties to the toxic empire. I sat confidently at the plaintiff table wearing a tailored charcoal suit. Terrence sat beside me organizing his legal files. Across the wide aisle sat my soon-to-be ex-husband. Spencer looked absolutely unrecognizable. The custom Italian suits and the arrogant billionaire posture were completely gone. He was wearing a wrinkled-off-the-rack dress shirt that was slightly too large for his shrinking frame. Without his mother, Spencer was completely and utterly broke. When the company seized his penthouse and cars, he moved into a cheap weekly motel on the outskirts of the city. Because his bank accounts were entirely frozen and his wealthy friends had abandoned him, Spencer could not afford to hire an attorney. He was forced to represent himself against one of the most ruthless corporate lawyers in the state. The family court judge had absolutely zero tolerance for nonsense. She spent the first 20 minutes reviewing the massive stack of evidence Terrence had officially submitted. She read the certified transcript of Spencer openly confessing to his affair on live national television. She reviewed the falsified medical records his mother had tried to use to steal my children. When she finally looked up from the files, her expression was completely merciless. The judge did not hesitate. Based on the overwhelming evidence of infidelity and the documented attempts to medically defraud the mother, the judge announced, her voice echoing sharply. I am granting full legal and physical custody of the twin infants to Natalie. Furthermore, the defendant is stripped of all visitation rights pending a psychological evaluation. Spencer slumped forward, resting his head in his hands. But the true humiliation was just beginning. The judge turned the page to the financial settlement portion of the divorce. Your Honor, Spencer pleaded, standing up. I cannot afford to pay child support. I was completely fired from my executive job. My corporate assets were seized, and my personal bank accounts are entirely empty. I have absolutely zero income right now, and I am practically homeless. You cannot force me to pay money that I do not have. That is factually incorrect, Your Honor, Terrence stated, handing a new financial document to the bailiff. While it is true the defendant is currently unemployed, he possesses a Master of Business Administration degree. Under state law, child support can be calculated based on the potential earning capacity of the defendant, not just his current unemployment. I looked at Spencer and offered a cold, completely unsympathetic smile. As an actuary, I had personally run the mathematical models on his educational background and submitted the exact calculations to the court. The judge reviewed the educational credentials and nodded in immediate agreement. She looked down at Spencer with absolute disdain. "Mr. Spencer," she ruled sharply, "you are an able-bodied, highly educated adult male. The court finds that your sudden intentional unemployment does not absolve you of your financial responsibilities to your children. Based on your proven potential earning capacity, I am ordering you to pay $3,000 a month in mandatory child support." Spencer gasped, leaning back, as if he had been physically struck by a heavy, blunt object. $3,000 a month? He choked out his voice, cracking with pure panic. "I do not even have $30 to my name right now. How am I supposed to pay that kind of money? You are going to do what millions of other responsible adults do every single day," the judge replied, slamming her heavy wooden gavel down onto the desk with a loud crack. "You are going to get out there and find a job. You can flip burgers, you can scrub toilets, or you can work a cash register. But if you fail to meet these monthly court-ordered payments, you will be held in civil contempt and sent directly to jail. This court is officially adjourned." Spencer realized in absolute horror that he was going to have to work a minimum-wage manual labor job just to stay out of a prison cell. The bailiff formally dismissed the room. I stood up, calmly gathering my paperwork and placing it into my designer leather bag. Spencer rushed out, desperately blocking the center aisle before I could reach the wooden doors. "Natalie, please," he begged, tears streaming freely down his pale, exhausted face. "I am so sorry for everything I did. Just talk to me for a second. Just give me 5 minutes to explain and make things right." I stopped walking. I looked directly at him, but I did not see a husband or a father, or even a human being worth my time. I simply looked right through him as if he were entirely invisible. Without saying a single word, I stepped smoothly around him. I did not break my stride. I did not acknowledge his existence. I just walked right out of the courtroom, leaving him crying completely alone in the empty silence. I walked out of the family courthouse into the bright afternoon sun, feeling an overwhelming sense of lightness. The toxic weights that had been dragging me down for years were finally cut completely loose. Terrence was waiting for me near his parked car, looking incredibly satisfied with the absolute destruction he had just orchestrated inside that courtroom. "You completely broke him," Terrence said, offering a rare, genuine smile as I approached. "Spencer will be flipping burgers by Monday if he wants to stay out of a county jail cell." It was the most satisfying child support hearing of my entire legal career. "I could not have done it without you, Terrence," I replied, shaking his hand warmly. "You took an insane risk by helping me. If Patricia had somehow won that corporate boardroom fight, she would have had you permanently disbarred, and your entire life would have been completely ruined." Terrence shrugged his broad shoulders, adjusting his pristine silk tie. "I am a corporate attorney, Natalie. I analyze risk every single day. And betting on a brilliant corporate actuary against a delusional, arrogant family was the safest investment I have ever made." "Speaking of investments," I said, opening my designer bag and pulling out a heavy sealed envelope, "I believe it is time we settle our final account." I handed the envelope to Terrence. He looked slightly confused as he broke the seal and pulled out a single certified bank draft. It was not a standard legal fee. It was a massive 7-figure sum pulled directly from the incredibly lucrative corporate buyout I had just finalized with Vanguard Global Shipping. "Natalie, this is entirely too much," Terrence argued, trying to hand the check back to me. "I helped you because Patricia is a monster, and my wife Caroline wanted to protect her nephews. I did not do this to extort millions of dollars from you." "It is not a legal fee, Terrence," I explained, pushing his hand away. "It is seed capital. You have spent years working for other massive law firms, constantly dealing with the politics and the corruption of people like Patricia. It is time you built your own empire. Take the money, start your own independent corporate law firm, Put your name on the door and run it exactly the way you want to. Terrence looked down at the massive check, the reality of the financial freedom washing over him. A slow, deep smile spread across his face. "Thank you, Natalie," he said quietly, his voice thick with genuine emotion. "I promise you, I will put this capital to very good use." A few months later, the bitter cold of a New York winter began to settle over the city. But the atmosphere inside Terrence and Caroline's beautiful brownstone home in Brooklyn was incredibly warm and inviting. It was Thanksgiving Day. For the first time in 5 years, I was actually looking forward to the holiday. In the past, Thanksgiving meant sitting at Patricia's massive dining table, enduring endless passive-aggressive insults, and watching Spencer completely ignore me while he drank expensive scotch. But this year, everything was entirely different. I walked into the spacious kitchen carrying my 2 perfectly healthy growing baby boys. Caroline immediately rushed over her face, lighting up with absolute joy. She took one of the twins from my arms, bouncing him gently on her hip. Caroline looked healthier and happier than I had ever seen her. The dark circles under her eyes were completely gone, and the constant anxious tension she always carried when dealing with her mother had entirely vanished. Cutting ties with her toxic family had been the hardest but most liberating decision of her life. "Have you heard anything from Patricia?" I asked gently, as we began arranging the massive spread of food on the kitchen island. Caroline shook her head, stirring a large pot of gravy. Not a single word. After the corporate buyout and the public humiliation, she completely isolated herself. She tried to call me a few times, demanding that I divorce Terrence because he helped you orchestrate the takeover. I told her I was choosing my husband, my peace, and my own family. Then, I permanently blocked her number. I have not spoken to her or Spencer since the court date. "I am so proud of you, Caroline," I said sincerely. "Family loyalty should never mean sacrificing your own sanity." Terrence walked into the kitchen carrying a bottle of red wine and 3 glasses. "The turkey is perfectly carved, and the dining table is officially set," he announced, handing me a glass of wine. We gathered around their cozy dining table, surrounded by the delicious smell of roasted turkey and warm spices. There were no designer crystal chandeliers or massive silver platters. There were no tense silences or cruel whispers. There was just genuine laughter, good food, and the profound comfort of being surrounded by people who actually respected and cared for each other. Terrence raised his glass of wine, proposing a toast. "To new beginnings," Terrence said, his deep voice carrying a note of absolute triumph. "To the massive success of the new law firm, and to the brilliant woman who completely dismantled an empire just to protect her children." We clinked our glasses together, the sound ringing out clearly in the warm dining room. We had survived the ultimate corporate war. But as I took a sip of my wine, I could not help but wonder how the villains of this story were spending their holidays completely alone in the cold ruins of the empire they had lost. While we were surrounded by warmth and laughter in Brooklyn, Patricia was sitting in a completely different reality. The massive Manhattan penthouse with its panoramic views and private elevators was gone. The Department of Justice had seized almost everything to cover the massive federal fines and the restitution for the pension fund embezzlement. By cooperating and surrendering her remaining assets, Patricia had barely managed to avoid a federal prison sentence. But the life she was left with was a prison of its own making. She now lived in a cramped 1-bedroom condo on the noisy outskirts of Queens. There were no maids to polish the floors, and no private chefs to prepare her meals. The walls were paper thin, and the constant roar of the elevated train rattled her cheap windows every 15 minutes. Patricia sat alone at a small laminate kitchen table, staring at a frozen microwave dinner. She was wearing a faded cashmere sweater that had snagged on the doorframe earlier that morning. Her absolute downfall was not just financial. It was intensely social. For decades, Patricia had ruled the New York high society scene with an iron fist. She had controlled the guest lists to the most exclusive charity galas and country clubs, but the second she lost her company and her money, the high society elites completely abandoned her. Just 2 days before Thanksgiving, she had walked into a discount grocery store to buy cheap ingredients. She saw a wealthy socialite she used to invite to her private yacht. Patricia tried to smile and say hello, hoping for a shred of sympathy. The woman had looked her up and down, let out a quiet scoff of disgust, and completely turned her back, walking away without saying a single word. Patricia realized in that devastating moment that nobody had ever actually liked her. They only liked her wealth and feared her authority. Once she lost both, she became completely invisible. Her golden boy son was faring no better. Spencer was currently working the late shift at a greasy fast food drive-thru out in New Jersey. His custom Italian suits had been replaced by a cheap polyester uniform that constantly smelled of stale cooking oil. Because of the strict court order demanding $3,000 a month in child support, a massive portion of his minimum wage paycheck was immediately garnished by the state. Every time a luxury car pulled up to his drive-thru window, Spencer had to lower his head, terrified that someone from his past life might recognize the humiliated billionaire heir handing them a paper bag of cheap cheeseburgers. He spent his shifts being yelled at by teenage managers for not bagging fries fast enough. And Amanda, the scheming mistress who thought she had secured a permanent ticket to the upper echelon of society, was currently sitting in the damp basement of her parents' home. She was entirely broke, heavily pregnant, and entirely ignored by Spencer, who blamed her for his spectacular ruin. Patricia pushed her untouched microwave meal away. The silence of the tiny condo was absolutely deafening. She looked around the cramped room, realizing that her ruthless pursuit of control had left her with absolutely nothing. She had sacrificed her daughter-in-law, her son, her own daughter Caroline, and her massive corporate legacy, all because she refused to relinquish an ounce of power. She closed her eyes and vividly remembered standing in my hospital room throwing that $22 million check onto my bed. It was the single most arrogant and destructive action of her entire existence. She looked at the small, cracked screen of her cheap prepaid smartphone resting on the laminate table. The holidays have a way of breaking down even the most stubborn pride. As the sun set on Thanksgiving Day, Patricia felt an overwhelming, crushing wave of absolute loneliness. She did not want to control the trust fund anymore. She just wanted to hear a familiar voice. She desperately wanted to hear the sounds of her newborn grandchildren cooing in the background. She wanted to know that some piece of her family had survived the absolute wreckage she had caused. Patricia picked up the phone, her hands trembling violently. She convinced herself that I would answer. She told herself that because it was a holiday of gratitude, I would take pity on a broken old woman and let her listen to the twins for just 1 minute. She scrolled through her limited contacts and found my name. She pressed the green call button and held the cheap plastic speaker to her ear, holding her breath in desperate anticipation. She waited for the ringing sound, but the line was completely dead. A few seconds later, an automated robotic voice clicked onto the line, delivering the final, devastating blow. The number you have reached has been disconnected and is no longer in service. Patricia slowly lowered the phone to the table. I had completely erased her from our lives. There was no forwarding number and no second chances. As the elevated train roared past her window, rattling the cheap glass, Patricia finally broke down, weeping loudly into the absolute isolation of her cold, empty room. While Patricia wept in the absolute isolation of her cold, empty room, I was standing 3,000 miles away, breathing in the crisp, salty air of the Pacific Northwest. The contrast between my former suffocating life in Manhattan and my new reality could not have been more spectacular. I had purchased a sprawling modern home nestled deeply into the side of a forested mountain, overlooking the dark blue waters of Puget Sound. There were no blaring city sirens, no aggressive paparazzi, and absolutely no toxic in-laws dropping by unannounced to inspect my parenting or criticize my background. There was only the sound of the cold wind moving through the ancient evergreen trees and the gentle crash of the ocean waves against the rocky shoreline below. I turned away from the massive floor-to-ceiling windows and walked over to my sleek, custom-built wooden desk. My dual monitors were glowing brightly, displaying complex financial models and intricate risk assessment charts. Even though I possessed a staggering amount of liquid wealth from the corporate buyout of Vanguard Global Shipping, I did not stop working. I genuinely loved being a corporate actuary, but now I operated entirely on my own terms. I had launched a highly specialized freelance consulting firm. I only accepted contracts from companies that I personally respected, and I commanded exorbitant hourly fees for my unique analytical skills. I answered to absolutely no corporate board. If an arrogant chief executive officer ever tried to speak down to me the way Patricia used to, I simply closed my laptop, terminated the consultation immediately, and walked away. I held all the leverage. I leaned back in my comfortable ergonomic chair and took a moment to reflect on the absolute chaos of the past 12 months. Whenever Caroline and Terrence visited us for holidays, they would often marvel at how smoothly I had dismantled a $500 million logistics empire. People often assume that to defeat a ruthless family with virtually infinite resources, you have to engage in vicious emotional warfare. They think you have to scream louder, fight dirtier, and match their toxic energy, blow for blow. But that is exactly how you lose to deeply narcissistic people. When you fight them with pure emotion, you are stepping directly onto their preferred battlefield. They feed off your panic and anxiety. They expertly manipulate your anger. They take your entirely justified tears and twist them into a public narrative of mental instability, which is exactly what Patricia attempted to do when she dragged those television psychiatrists onto the national morning shows. I did not win my absolute peace by fighting emotionally. I won by stepping completely out of the emotional arena and walking straight into the data room. I stopped looking at my cowardly husband and his incredibly toxic mother as family members. Instead, I started viewing them strictly as high-risk variables in a highly complex financial equation. I calculated their massive blind spots. I quantified their absolute arrogance. Patricia firmly believed that her immense old money wealth made her completely untouchable. She assumed that tossing a $22 million bribe at a middle-class woman would permanently crush my spirit and force me into absolute submission. She never bothered to realize that handing a highly trained corporate actuary a massive amount of liquid capital right in the middle of a historic stock crash was the exact equivalent of handing a loaded weapon to a master sniper. I did not panic. I simply took the raw data, analyzed the market risk, and executed the absolute most devastating mathematical outcome possible. A soft, joyful noise gently interrupted my deep reflections. I turned my chair away from the glowing screens and looked across the spacious sunlit office. My twin boys were just waking up from their afternoon nap. They were sitting together in their plush, enclosed play area, babbling happily and reaching out for their favorite brightly colored wooden blocks. They were perfectly healthy, completely safe, and beautifully unaware of the massive corporate war that had once tried to claim them as mere financial assets to secure a trust fund. I stood up from my desk and walked over to them, kneeling down on the thick woven rug to scoop them both into my arms. I held them close to my chest, feeling their tiny, steady heartbeats against mine. They laughed, grabbing at strands of my hair. I looked past them out the large window toward the towering pine trees standing tall against the clear blue sky. A profound and overwhelming realization washed over my entire soul. I did not just protect my children from the suffocating grip of a deeply toxic family. By taking Patricia's money, leveraging her own greed, and completely destroying her empire, I had bought their absolute freedom. By taking Patricia's money, leveraging her own greed, and completely destroying her empire, I had bought their absolute freedom. It is an incredibly strange thing to look back on a life you completely dismantled and realize you do not miss a single piece of it. When I first married Spencer, I genuinely believed I was stepping into a modern fairy tale. I thought the wealth, the social prestige, and the immense power of his family would offer a permanent blanket of security for the future we were trying to build together. But I quickly learned that for people like Patricia and Spencer, money is never a tool for security or comfort. It is always a weapon of absolute control. They use their financial leverage to dictate your choices, suppress your voice, and force you into a state of constant, terrifying dependence. They meticulously groom you to believe that without their generous umbrella, you would simply cease to exist in the real world. But that is the greatest and most destructive lie toxic people will ever tell you. If you are watching this video right now and you feel trapped by someone who constantly uses money, social status, or heavy familial obligation to keep you chained to their abuse, I need you to listen to me very carefully. Your actual worth is not determined by their flawed conditional valuation. You do not need to come from old money or possess a famous last name to be incredibly powerful. You just need to be smart, patient, and fiercely protective of your own hard-earned independence. You must learn to separate your deep emotional pain from your logical, strategic responses. When my husband brought his pregnant mistress into my hospital room, and my mother-in-law tried to purchase my newborn babies, I could have easily shattered into a million pieces right there on the pristine hospital bed. I could have cried, screamed, and spent the next 10 years fighting a losing battle in a rigged family court system funded by their billions. Instead, I forced myself to see the massive structural weaknesses in their towering ivory tower. I saw the fragile cracks in their overinflated, arrogant egos. I took their absolute worst insult, and I mathematically weaponized it. Financial independence is not just about having a large bank account or a high credit score. It is about possessing the sheer unyielding mental clarity to look at a terrifying situation and quietly calculate your own flawless exit strategy. My twin boys are going to grow up in a beautiful house, filled with fresh air and genuine unconditional love. They will never know the cold, sterile feeling of that massive Manhattan penthouse. They will never be treated as convenient biological pawns meant to unlock a grandfather clause or secure a corporate merger. They will never have to perform for their inheritance or endure the crushing weight of a family that only values them for their genetic lineage. I broke the cycle of generational trauma, not by begging for basic human respect, but by forcefully removing my children from the toxic equation entirely. The financial media eventually lost interest in the spectacular downfall of the corporate shipping empire. The tabloids moved on to other celebrity scandals, but the permanent reality of what happened will forever remain written in the legally binding corporate ledgers. Patricia is a forgotten woman, living in a cramped, noisy apartment, isolated from the high society she worshipped. Spencer is a disgraced former heir working a minimum wage drive through shift just to pay his mandatory monthly child support. And Amanda is sitting in a damp suburban basement, completely broke and entirely alone. They all truly believed they could rewrite the rules of basic human decency because they possessed a massive fortune. But numbers do not lie, and mathematics absolutely does not care about your fragile ego. If my incredible journey resonated with you today, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more stories of survival and absolute triumph. Share this video with anyone who needs a harsh but necessary reminder that toxic family members hold absolutely no real power over your destiny once you decide to stop playing by their rigged rules. Let me know in the comments below if you have ever used your own logic and emotional detachment to completely outsmart a narcissist in your own life. Your story might just give someone else the courage they desperately need to finally walk away and build a beautiful life of their own. I look down at my peacefully sleeping children, feeling the cool ocean breeze drift through the open window of my beautiful home. I smile, feeling an absolute profound sense of lasting peace. Patricia thought $22 million was the price of my children. She didn't realize it was the exact amount I needed to buy her entire world and burn it to the ground. Never negotiate with an actuary. Fade to black. The story of Natalie dismantling a billionaire family's empire teaches a profound lesson about the true nature of power when confronting toxic manipulation. Often we are conditioned to believe that fighting back requires matching an abuser's emotional intensity, screaming louder, arguing harder, or desperately defending our character against their vicious lies. However, this narrative masterfully illustrates that engaging emotionally is exactly what manipulators want. When you fight them on an emotional battlefield, you play by their rigged rules. The ultimate lesson here is the triumph of strategic detachment. Natalie didn't weep or beg when handed a $22 million bribe to abandon her newborn twins. She analyzed the data, assessed the vulnerabilities of her enemies, and turned their own immense arrogance into the very weapon that destroyed them. By removing her reactive emotions from the equation, she maintained absolute mental clarity. Toxic individuals rely on your panic, fear, and desire for validation to maintain their control. They use money status and familial obligation as heavy leverage to keep you subservient. Natalie's journey teaches us that the most devastating response to abuse is not a dramatic, tearful confrontation, but a quiet, meticulously calculated exit strategy. She quantified her self-worth, recognized the structural weaknesses of her abusers, and executed a flawless takeover of her own destiny. Her victory reminds us that true independence is achieved when we stop reacting to toxicity and start strategically planning our freedom. We may not all be corporate actuaries dealing with multi-million-dollar trust funds, but we can all apply this calculated, emotionally detached mindset to protect our own peace and well-being. If you are currently trapped in a toxic dynamic, take a step back today. Evaluate your logical exit strategy and start building the fiercely independent life you truly deserve.